Good morning. My name is Mark Susser. I am the historian of the State Department, and I would like to welcome all of you to the department and to this conference on the United States, the Middle East, and the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. This is the second annual historical conference sponsored by the Department of State, and as in our first, and we think successful, conference last year on Guatemala and the 1954 coup, this conference coincides with the release of a new volume of the Department's official documentary series, Foreign Relations of the United States. The volume covers U.S. policy immediately before, during, and after the 1967 war, an event whose legacy is still with us today. The 1991 law that governs the Foreign Relations series requires that it be a thorough, accurate, and reliable documentary record of U.S. foreign policy. And we believe that this is exactly what we provide in the volume that we are releasing today about this watershed event in the history of the modern Middle East. Although the broad outlines of the war are well known, this volume includes many new details not previously available to the general public, and some that were not previously available even to scholars of the period. In accordance with the requirements of the law, this volume provides an accurate and comprehensive account of U.S. involvement in the events surrounding the 1967 war. Our historians have had full access to the files of all the cabinet agencies, departments involved in the foreign policy process during the years of the administration of President Lyndon Johnson, and have selected for publication those key documents that best tell the story of the evolution and development of U.S. foreign policy during this critical period, and of the United States' role in the events surrounding the 1967 war. The volume fulfills the requirements of the law that the published record shall omit no facts that were of major importance in reaching a decision, and that nothing shall be omitted for the purpose of concealing a defective policy. Only a small amount of the material selected for publication in this volume could not be declassified, either for reasons of national security or to protect intelligence sources and methods. We do not believe that the material excised from a few of the 542 documents published in the volume distorts or conceals any facts that are material to the story that this volume has to tell. The publication of foreign relations volumes, such as this one, provides an unrivaled example of a government making its business open to public scrutiny and of transparency. For more than 140 years, the Foreign Relations of the United States series has provided a powerful tool, enabling the American public, and indeed people all over the world, to understand our country's foreign policy process. Today, more than 36 historians and editors in the Office of the Historian work on the preparation and publication of the series. By publishing the key documents themselves, rather than presenting an interpretive analysis, the series is dedicated to objectivity and an absence of what all you journalists in the audience today might call spin. Why do we do this? Because we and Congress believe that in a democracy, it is important for a government to tell its people the truth. We believe it's important that the American people know what their government has done in its dealings with the rest of the world once sufficient time has passed, and the law specifies 30 years after the event, and still classified material has been protected. We recognize the vital importance to democracy of openness and of transparency, but we also acknowledge that a certain tension exists between a government's need for confidentiality and the people's right to know. Secrecy is a necessary condition for the conduct of foreign policy. But we believe that the best way to maintain the delicate balance between secrecy and trust for the citizens and between citizens and their government is to ensure that the actions of government are not hidden forever. And that is why the Department of State publishes the Foreign Relations series. The complete text of this Foreign Relations volume is being placed on the internet this morning and should be up and available at noon today. The department's website is www.state.gov. We will also make a few of the printed volumes available for use by the media in the department's press office. Let me set forth our purpose here today. This is an academic conference, which clearly will be dealing with some controversial issues, many of which still resonate in the current political situation. However, I would like to emphasize that our mandate for this conference is historical, that what we are going to focus on are the events of the 1960s, focus on the facts, and focus on various interpretations of them. But this conference is not a venue nor a vehicle for personal or political agendas or for debate about the current political situation in the Middle East. While our discussion may well provide some useful insights into the origins of current problems, which today's diplomats may be grappling with, our focus is solely on the events of this period. We made extensive efforts to ensure broad participation in this conference, and we are pleased that several scholars from the Middle East, from Egypt, Israel, and Jordan, are here with us today, along with scholars from several other nations. When people ask me what the significance of a foreign relations volume like this is, I reply that the significance is that the United States government is finally providing the complete story of these events to its people and indeed to the world. However, when I am asked about the significance of a particular document, I generally decline to reply, because it really is not our mission to explain the documents related to the events, only to provide them. We'll leave it to the historians, the journalists, and the average reader among the public to draw their own conclusions. This is fully in keeping with the long tradition of objectivity embodied in the Foreign Relations series and the work of the Office of the Historian. I urge you to not necessarily rely on the interpretations and conclusions of others. Rather, read all the documents and draw all your conclusions. In order to formally open this conference, we have with us one of those who is, in fact, grappling with Middle East issues on a daily basis, one of the State Department's most distinguished career diplomats. Ambassador David Satterfield is currently Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. He assumed this position in June 2001. Prior to his current position, he has served in numerous key posts, including Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, Director of the Department's Office of Israel and Arab-Israeli Affairs, and most recently as Ambassador to Lebanon. Ambassador Satterfield.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome you to what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting day of discussion of those events of June 1967 and the documents that have been just declassified and released for what I'm sure will be just the beginning of a series of very interesting academic and indeed beyond academic discussion and debate. And I think as the volumes of this extraordinary series continue to be released, covering the period following 1967, more and more the remarks of the speaker on the relevancy of those now almost 4 decades old events will certainly come clear. While you may be bound today by the injunction to confine your discussion to the historical record, to the events of 1967, I fortunately am not so bound, and will be discussing how the events of 67, how that war continues to impact the region, and those challenges which the Speaker alluded to that we engaged in the diplomatic business today here in Washington and the Middle East have to reflect upon those events, have to deal with them in our search to try to bring about a peaceful resolution to the Israel-Arab conflict. Although the Six-Day War took place over 35 years ago, its consequences certainly continue to reverberate today. The war defined the shape, literally, of the continuing Middle East conflict and physically changed the face of the region. When the war ended on June 10, 1967, Israel was in control of more than double the amount of land it had controlled the week before, and Israel was in control of a Palestinian population. That fact has been a key element in the Arab-Israeli conflict and efforts to end it ever since. Those of us who work on the Middle East peace process find that we look back daily to the events of 1967. The war's after effects shape our efforts, as in, for example, UN Resolution 242, passed in November 1967 in direct response to the Six-Day War. 242, along with the later UN Resolution 338, has been the basis for every major peace plan put forward over the last 30 years, including the roadmap for peace. Resolution 242 enshrines the broad principles of withdrawal, mutual recognition, the right of all states in the region to live in peace and security. It has been widely recognized, including by the parties themselves, that these principles must be the basis for any lasting final status arrangement and must serve as the guidelines for any successful peace negotiations. They mean that our goal must be the realization of Israel's right to exist in peace within secure and recognized borders, and the right of Palestinians to live in a secure, independent, viable, democratic and sovereign state of Palestine. The roadmap is an effort to bring the parties to the conflict, Israelis and Palestinians, to a point where they can resolve the situation established by the events of 1967. The roadmap is the implementation of President Bush's vision of two states, Israel and Palestine, living by side in peace and security. That vision offers the hope of a peaceful future to the people of the region. But unfortunately, both hope and a peaceful future too often seem far away to the people of the Middle East. Hope has evaporated in the understandable rage of Israeli suffering through horrible acts of terror. It has been swallowed up in the deep frustrations, daily humiliations, and wounded dignity of Palestinians living under occupation. And what is being lost in all of this is the vision of a different kind of future, of a different kind of existence between these two peoples and indeed between all the peoples of the Middle East. In order for hope to reemerge, to take hold, both Israelis and Palestinians must see the possibility of that different reality from the one that they witness today. Israelis must see an end to terror, the prospect of a final end to the conflict, and full acceptance in the region as neighbors. Palestinians must see their dignity respected, their hope restored for an early negotiated end to the occupation that began in 1967, and the creation of a viable independent state. Such a state cannot and will not be based upon a foundation of terror and violence. On that, there can be no concessions, no flexibility, no turning of blind eyes. Palestinians must be honest with themselves on this point, and will have to confront those among them who would drag the Palestinian people and their dreams further down a dead-end path. A transformed Palestinian leadership is essential to the ability to achieve a Palestinian state. Ending violence, reforming Palestinian political institutions are not a favor to any outsider, not to the United States, not to Israel, not to the international community. They are deeply and fundamentally in the self-interest of Palestinians, and they are the only workable path to statehood and the end to occupation. They are the only workable path forward to realization of the legitimate national aspirations of the Palestinian people. But the emergence of a Palestinian state and the achievement of those aspirations alongside a secure Israel is not just a dream of the Palestinians. Its realization is intimately connected with the future of Israel and Israelis as well, and with the kind of Israel that the current generation of Israeli leaders and citizens will pass on to their children and grandchildren. I must be frank, the demographic picture is very stark. Within the next decade or so, Jews will be a minority in the area encompassing Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, those territories acquired in June 1967. As Israeli settlements expand, those settlements that began immediately after June 10, 1967, and their populations increase, it becomes ever more difficult to see how two peoples can be separated into two states. The fact is that settlements continue to grow today, encouraged by specific ongoing government policies and at enormous expense to Israel's economy. And this persists even as it becomes clearer and clearer that the logic of settlements and the reality of demographics could threaten the future of Israel itself as a Jewish democratic state. For friends of Israel, the conclusion is hard to escape. Settlement activity must stop because it ultimately undermines Israeli as well as Palestinian interests. The course of the separation barrier under construction now remains a significant problem as well, not in its existence per se as a separation barrier between Israel and the territories of the West Bank, but because its planned route inside the West Bank isolates Palestinians from each other and from their land and their livelihoods, prejudices negotiations, and, like settlement activity itself, takes everyone further from the confidence and trust necessary to achieve the President's vision of two states. It is essential that Palestinians understand violence and terror will never be a vehicle for achievement of their aspirations. It is equally important to preserve the possibility, though, that a viable state can be achieved by a Palestinian leadership that is committed to ending terror. That reality, the obligations and responsibilities incumbent upon both sides, and indeed incumbent upon those in the region and the international community, including the United States, who are supportive of this process, underpins our continued commitment, the President's continued personal commitment to his June 24th vision, and to the roadmap advanced by the Quartet as a means of pursuing it. There is important work being done today by others than those involved in government. Non-official channels, such as the grassroots efforts of Sari Nusseibeh and Ami Ayalon, the more detailed proposals of the Geneva Accord and Geneva Initiative, all are reminders not only that dedicated Palestinians and Israelis, people of goodwill, can still negotiate with each other, but also that there is something to negotiate about. These efforts need to be encouraged to foster an atmosphere of hope, to help keep alive the two-state vision, and to help preserve the best and most innovative ideas developed in previous negotiations and discussions. But in the meantime, as that vision of two states still is there in front of us, but not yet achieved, we are left with the hard reality that roadmaps, visions, final status proposals and plans don't implement themselves. They require hard work and hard choices from everyone. The Palestinian Authority must make difficult decisions, particularly on steps which engage them in changing the security situation on the ground and bringing about an end to terror. Israel also faces painful choices about the kind of country it wants to be. A heated debate is underway among Palestinians, the media, and the public about the choices that Israel will ultimately have to make. And this is a healthy debate. The United States has always sought to support the parties as they make these difficult decisions. We have tried to be an active party and to play a role that addresses the political, security, economic, and humanitarian needs of the region. The political highlights of the peace process are often cited. The 1978 Camp David Accords, the famous handshake on the lawn of the White House on September 13, 1993, for example. But the daily work of building economies, institutions, and meeting human needs all too often receives much less acclaim. The United States alone has provided roughly $180 billion in assistance to the parties in the past 50 years. Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinians have been the primary recipients of this assistance, as we have sought and as we continue to seek, to help them overcome the conflict that began in 1967 and meet the financial demands of resolving it. Assistance to the Palestinians is particularly critical today as they labor to establish a working government and to build a society in which peace can flourish, to prepare for statehood. The U.S. has provided approximately $1 billion to Palestinians in the last decade, not including our continued commitment to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. We're not alone in this effort. The international community as a whole has also expended tremendous energy and money over the years to meet humanitarian needs, support regional economies, and create the conditions necessary for a just and lasting peace. As we know all too well, achievement of that peace requires financial support as well as difficult political decisions. And here, as in the political field, the region will not find the United States absent in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. As we reflect back on the '67 war, as you engage in your discussions today, the impact of those events cannot be ignored. This is not purely an academic discussion divorced from the reality of lives and life in the Middle East, in the region, indeed here in the United States. The task for all of us who have focused upon the issues of the Middle East, for those of us who are working to bring peace to this troubled region, is to create a reality in which an environment in which a new reality based on tolerance, understanding, and peace, a reality very lacking in June 1967, can flourish. 30 years from now, I would like the person in my position, indeed those in your position, to be able to say at a conference like this one that the war of 1967 no longer defines the Middle East. For now, however, it does. And we look forward to the many distinguished panelists and equally distinguished audience members who will be commenting today on the meaning of the events of that dramatic week in June. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Satterfield. We're going to begin with an introduction of the volume, and this is it right here, almost 1,100 pages, by the historian who actually put it together. Dr. Harriet Schwarr spent 26 years in the office of the historian. She has since retired, but she agreed to come back here for a last appearance and explain to you exactly what it was she found. Dr. Schwarr?
I'm just going to give you a few highlights of this volume, which, as Mark says, is almost 1,100 pages, drawn from a much larger, of course, amount of documentation, vastly larger. This is one of what will eventually be 34 volumes of documents on U.S. foreign policy during Lyndon Johnson's presidency, and the second of 3 volumes documenting U.S. policy on Arab-Israeli issues during that time. It begins in mid-May 1967, when Egyptian troops began moving into the Sinai. Egypt's President Nasser requested the withdrawal of UN forces from the border with Israel, and the U.S. government began to move into crisis mode. It concludes with the passage of UN Resolution 242 in November 1967. The major sources of documents were the presidential papers at the Johnson Library and the State Department records, most which are now at the National Archives. Other sources include records of the Defense Department, Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, and Naval Security Group. I tried to include a wide variety of documents reflecting the kind of intelligence that reached Johnson and his advisors, especially before and during the war. Not everything I included was declassified, although almost everything was. A few documents were not declassified, and there were excisions in some others. However, the most important documents were released, and the withheld material would add very little of substance. The focus is on the view from the White House. Johnson and his advisors saw the crisis very much in the context of the Cold War. They learned of the Soviet warning to the Egyptians of an impending Israeli attack on Syria, which according to U.S. information was not true, and they wondered what the Soviets were up to. When Nasser announced that he would close the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli ships, they wondered if Moscow was behind it. At an NSC meeting on May 24th, Johnson declared he wanted to play every card in the UN to avoid war. But he asked, what if there was a war anyway? Would the U.S. have to intervene on Israel's behalf? If that happened, would the Soviets intervene? In the course of this meeting, the possibility of unconventional weapons in the area was raised. DCI Richard Helms was quite positive in stating there were no nuclear weapons in the area. JCS Chairman General Earl Wheeler expressed skepticism, but acknowledged that Helms had more information on the subject. No one else questioned Helms' statement. There was no further discussion at that time, and this is one of only a handful of references to this subject at all in this volume, although there's a good deal in the preceding volume and succeeding volume. President Johnson wanted to honor President Eisenhower's pledge of U.S. support for Israel's access to the Gulf of Aqaba, which Eisenhower had made in 1957 to get Israel to evacuate the Sinai. But Johnson certainly did not want to get involved in a war in the Middle East. He wrote to Nasser and to Israel's Prime Minister Eshkol, urging both sides to avoid hostilities, and the U.S. and the British tried to get international support to keep the Gulf open with a multi-nation naval force if necessary. When Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban visited Washington and met with the President on May 26, Johnson told him in a carefully formulated statement that was both a promise and a warning, Israel will not be alone unless it chooses to go alone. U.S. officials continued to work on getting support for international action, but with each day that passed, this seemed less likely to succeed. Eshkol warned in a letter to Johnson that there was growing pressure on Israel to take action, and the Israelis sent the head of Mossad, Meir Amit, to Washington to try to clarify the U.S. position. Amit met with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on June 1st and warned him that the Israelis could not maintain their high level of mobilization for long, and that their great fear was that a preemptive air attack by Egypt would result in the loss of their air superiority. McNamara neither warned against a first strike nor said anything to encourage one. He asked Amit how many casualties he thought Israel would incur in an attack on the Sinai. Amit said this would depend on who hit first. With air superiority, he thought Israel would only have around 4,000 casualties. McNamara said he would convey Amit's views to the President. It was clear from this that Israel was considering a preemptive strike, but how soon was another question. The next day, Israeli Minister Epi Ivran told Special Assistant to the President Walt Rostow that he thought Israel would take no action before June 11th at the earliest. Meanwhile, word came through Robert Anderson, a Texas businessman and former cabinet member who had long-standing connections with both Johnson and Nasser, that Nasser was interested in sending Egyptian Vice President Zakaria Mohideen to visit the U.S. Washington replied promptly, encouraging a visit and stating that Johnson would meet with Mohideen if he came. The visit was scheduled for June 7th. Anderson's report of his meeting with Nasser did not suggest that Nasser had any interest in compromise, but as of June 4th, Washington officials were busy planning for the visit. Tapes of telephone calls to Johnson from Dean Rusk and Walt Rostow early on June 5th showed Johnson anxious to find out who had started the fighting. The answer to that question was not immediately clear, although it soon was. Unfortunately, these are almost the only tapes of Johnson's telephone conversations relating to Arab-Israeli issues in 1967. There are few tapes on any subject dating from 1967. A third June 5th tape is of a call from McNamara informing the President of an incoming hotline message from Premier Kosygin. Both Johnson and McNamara were obviously taken by surprise by the message, the first use of the hotline for substantive purposes since its creation in 1963. There were a total of 20 hotline messages during the next 6 days. Later on June 5th, Johnson set up the NSC Special Committee, chaired by McGeorge Bundy as a crisis management committee, perhaps thinking of it as a counterpart to the XCOM of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Harold Saunders' handwritten notes are the only records of the meetings, apart from brief memos of decisions. The notes are fragmentary and often not clear, but they are included in the volume because they shed some light on Johnson and his advisors' reactions to events during the war and their efforts to formulate a policy in the aftermath of the war. Before I get to the treatment of the Liberty incident in the volume, I'd like to touch briefly on the post-war period, where there's a great deal of very interesting material. At the end of the war, the administration was faced with a radically different Middle East. The Arab states demanded Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories before there could be any negotiations, while Israel stated its willingness to withdraw, but only in the context of a genuine peace settlement. In a June 19th statement, Johnson declared continuing U.S. support for the political independence and territorial integrity of all the states in the area. In practical terms, Israeli withdrawal only as part of a full peace settlement. In essence, land for peace. The administration urged the Israelis not to take steps that would tend to make their occupation permanent. For example, it pressed them to allow refugees who had fled from the West Bank into Jordan to return to their homes. When plans for the first Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Golan Heights were announced in September, Washington expressed concern both privately and publicly. In a meeting with Eban on October 24th, Johnson pointedly reminded him of the U.S. position on territorial integrity and boundaries. The Soviets had been pouring new arms into Egypt, however, and pressure was growing to relax the ban on arms sale to both sides that the U.S. had imposed during the war. In the fall, the administration began to permit the shipment of previously agreed-upon arms to Israel and moderate Arab states. Egypt had broken relations with the U.S. during the war, and Nasser continued to charge that the Sixth Fleet had participated in Israel's June 5th air attack. This was not true, as Egyptian Foreign Minister Mahmoud Riyad acknowledged in an October 10th meeting with Assistant Secretary Lucius Battle. Nonetheless, Washington took steps to reopen direct contacts with Egypt soon after the war, ignoring several rather dubious indirect approaches from Cairo. Rusk met with Nasser advisor Mahmoud Fawzi at the UN special session in June, and with Foreign Minister Riyad when he came to the UN in the fall. The State Department sent a Foreign Service officer with a good deal of Cairo experience to head the U.S. interest section of the Spanish embassy in Cairo. Robert Anderson visited Cairo again at the end of October. This is, of course, an unofficial contact, and reported to Washington on his meeting with Nasser. The U.S. and Egyptian positions, however, remained far apart. King Hussein was under strong pressure from Nasser to stay with the Arab United Front against negotiations with Israel. However, in mid-July, he sent a message to U.S. officials that he was prepared to conclude some sort of arrangement with Israel. Washington passed this information on to the Israelis, and they indicated willingness to talk to Hussein. Johnson and his advisors agreed that this initiative, which they gave the code name Sandstorm, should be encouraged, but they thought a mediator would be needed. Johnson said he would like to find somebody to work out a settlement. The clock is ticking, he said. There is no question but what the Arabs have no confidence in us. We can't sit and let these things go. He didn't want the U.S. to mediate, however, and it soon developed that the Israelis didn't want a mediator anyway. Washington encouraged Hussein to undertake negotiations, but made it clear that the U.S. role would be limited, and Hussein decided to postpone taking action. There were secret talks between Jordan and Israel in 1968, however, and there is material relating to them in the volume which follows this one. Meanwhile, of course, there were discussions behind the scenes at the UN to formulate a resolution that might provide a basis for a Middle East settlement. In addition to talks with the Israelis, Egyptians, and others at the UN special session in June and July, there were talks with the Soviets. These collapsed when U.S. Representative Arthur Goldberg learned the Soviets had been playing a double game, discussing one text with him and showing a different one to their Arab friends. The effort to formulate a resolution resumed in October. Several weeks of intense negotiations, especially with the Israelis and Jordanians, especially on the U.S. side, especially with the Israelis and Jordanians, culminated in the passage of UN Resolution 242. And this is an enormously complicated and complex story, which I wouldn't even begin to try to summarize, but there is a great deal of material on it in the volume. And now let me backtrack to the Liberty. The U.S. Signals Intelligence ship Liberty was dispatched during the pre-war crisis to the Eastern Mediterranean. I did not find the instructions to the NSA personnel on the ship in the files, but as I noted earlier, it is clear that Soviet intentions were very much on the minds of Johnson and his advisors. The ship was still making its way through the Mediterranean when the war broke out. On the morning of June 8th, fourth day of the war, after messages belatedly modifying its orders had gone astray, it took up its position about 14 miles off the Sinai Peninsula. It was attacked that afternoon by Israeli jet aircraft and torpedo boats with severe damage and many casualties. The NSA cable to the White House of June 22, 1967, which NSA declassified a few months ago and which you may have seen on the NSA website, is in the volume. It states that there were no intercepts of the actual attack. And it includes a transcript, fragmentary and incomplete, of communications between two Israeli helicopters that were sent in the aftermath of the attack to pick up survivors, and between them and those pilots and their air controllers. At first, the air controller told the helicopter pilots the ship was Egyptian. It was some time before they made out GTR-5 on the hull of the ship, and still longer before they confirmed that the ship's flag was American. In my research at the Johnson Library and in CIA, NSA, and Naval Security Group files, I saw preliminary versions of this transcript. Both the substance of the transcripts and the times indicated made it clear that they all reflected the same exchanges between the helicopter pilots and the control tower. I saw no transcripts of the attack itself, or any indication that there had been such transcripts. The focus here, as in the rest of the volume, is on the view, largely is on the view from Washington. The air attack began about 8 a.m. Washington time on June 8th. Walt Rostow reported to Johnson at 9:50 a.m. that the Liberty had been torpedoed by an unknown attacker and that reconnaissance aircraft were out from the Sixth Fleet. In fact, it was not reconnaissance aircraft, but armed A-4s and A-1s that had been sent. The Sixth Fleet and the Soviet fleet were not far apart in the Mediterranean. The Soviets would surely be aware of U.S. jets heading for the war zone. At 10:15 a.m., it's 25 minutes later, Deputy Undersecretary Foy Kohler called the Soviet chargé to inform him that a U.S. ship had been attacked and an aircraft had been sent to investigate. Half an hour later, the report reached Washington that the Israelis had informed the U.S. naval attaché, with abject apologies, quote unquote, that they had erroneously attacked a U.S. ship. The information was quickly passed to the White House, and Kohler promptly passed it on to the Soviet chargé. Johnson sent a similar message to Kosygin via the hotline, suggesting obliquely that he inform Nasser, which he did. In other words, the immediate reaction at the White House was to ensure that the incident did not set off a broader conflict. By the time the NSC, National Security Council Special Committee, met the following evening, news had reached Washington about the details of the attack and the extent of the casualties. Dean Rusk reported that senators on the Foreign Relations Committee were outraged. Veteran Presidential Advisor Clark Clifford called it inconceivable that the attack was an accident. He thought they should handle it as if the Arabs or the Soviets had done it. According to Saunders' notes, the President subscribed to this 100%. Rusk sent a stiff note to the Israeli ambassador the following day, calling the attack an act of military recklessness reflecting wanton disregard for human life. The Israeli reply 2 days later rejected this characterization, and while reiterating regret for the loss of life, pointed out that the Israelis had not been informed of the ship's presence in the area. At the special committee meeting that evening, the mood was, as Saunders put it, sour. Johnson and his advisors agreed that it was a terrible note. And Johnson asked Helms for a special study on the incident, drawing on anything that was available, including NSA material. A CIA memo of June 13th, responding to this request, reported that they had no intercepts of the attacking planes and torpedo boats, but that the helicopter pilots' communications left little doubt that the Israelis had failed to identify the Liberty as a U.S. ship. A follow-up CIA memo on June 21st noted that the Liberty had been identified prior to the attacks, but concluded that the Israelis were not aware at the time of the attack that they were attacking a U.S. ship. It concluded that the attack was not made in malice, but was by mistake, representing gross negligence. The Defense Intelligence Agency reached a similar conclusion, as did Clark Clifford, who made an extensive examination of the intelligence material at Johnson's request. In this short time, I've only been able to scratch the surface of what's in the volume. I can only say, read the unabridged version. And what does it all mean? I'm sure there will be no lack of interpretations, and some of which we will be hearing in the next couple of days. Of course, these are all documents from the U.S. record. One of the things I find particularly exciting about this conference is the opportunity to hear perspectives drawn not only from U.S. records, but from records that are beginning to become available in other archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. We'll now begin our first panel, and we will proceed in the following manner. I will introduce each panelist. Each panelist will then speak for 15 minutes in turn, without interruption, for questions or comments. Once all speakers and our commentator have completed their remarks, we will then move to discussion and exchange of views among the panelists. This will then be followed by a period of questions from interested members of the audience. I will introduce each panelist briefly. You have in your package more detailed bios. I should also point out that the only material that has been authorized for distribution is in these packages. I understand some other materials are being distributed, and these are not official nor authorized by the department. Our first speaker is Dr. David Robarge. He joined the Central Intelligence Agency in 1989, originally as an analyst of Middle Eastern affairs, and then moved to the CIA history staff in 1996. He has a PhD from Columbia University, and his publications include a biography of Chief Justice John Marshall, which some of you may have read, and a classified history of the CIA under Director McCone, which most of you have probably not had an opportunity to read. Dr. Robarge.
Good morning. The actual title of my talk is Serving at the Pleasure of the President, Richard Helms, Lyndon Johnson, and CIA Analysis During the Six-Day War. And what I hope to do is provide a kind of a leadership personality perspective on the relationship between CIA, the White House, within the context of the analysis of the Six-Day War. Helms, who was the director from 1966 to 73, had the professional misfortune of having to serve under two of the most difficult presidents in American history, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. And in his recently published memoir, Helms wrote that his own director of intelligence analysis, Russell Jack Smith, described my working relationship with President Johnson as golden, in the sense that it was close to the maximum that any DCI might hope to achieve. However comforting, this assessment is too generous, Helms goes on. It was not my relationship with LBJ that mattered. It was his perception of the value of the data and assessments the CIA provided him that carried the day. And certainly the key intelligence assessment during Helms's tenure under Johnson that carried the day was its strikingly accurate analysis about the Six-Day War. And in this current context of controversy over politicized intelligence assessments relating to Iraqi WMD and seemingly everything else related to that war, this is an interesting case study, one of those rare instances in which unpoliticized intelligence has a specific, clear-cut, and immediate impact on U.S. foreign policy. The CIA was correct about the timing, duration, and outcome of the war. These right answers quickly reached U.S. leaders in an immediately usable form, and the agency did not temper its judgments when faced with policymaker resistance. And so, in sum, the whole Six-Day War intelligence scenario demonstrates that when the agency advances well-substantiated judgments advocated by a respected DCI with access to the White House, that analysis can prevail over political pressures and the predilections of policymakers. This was especially important for Helms at this time. He needed to impress Lyndon Johnson because Johnson had little experience with intelligence or even interest in it when he suddenly became president in November '63, and his attitudes hadn't changed appreciably in the nearly 4 years preceding the Six-Day War. It's instructive that Johnson selected the hapless William Rayborn to replace the very strong-willed John McCone as DCI in April '65. This clearly indicated where he intended to put CIA in the Washington power structure. And Johnson preferred to hear VIP gossip from J. Edgar Hoover instead of facts and analysis from the CIA. At the time he appointed Helms as DCI in June '66, Johnson was not yet convinced that intelligence could advance his policies, and he was already annoyed at the agency's negativism about Vietnam. And in addition, in early '67, you have a public scandal over CIA political covert action funding, the so-called Ramparts revelations. And so CIA has a public relations problem early in the '67 period, and Helms has to overcome this in some fashion. Of course, Johnson is a very hard sell, a hard mind to penetrate, a difficult man to deal with. Russell Jack Smith has given an interesting vignette of his own frustration about a White House assignment to evaluate the pros and cons of a new U.S. initiative in Vietnam. And it shows the way in which the White House worked and the way in which Helms tried to deal with this relationship. Smith says, if one based a decision on the conclusions of our CIA study, the result was obvious. The gain of the new initiative was not worth the cost. Nevertheless, the President announced the next day that he intended to go ahead with it. I was distinctly annoyed that our admirable piece of analysis, done under forced draft by the White House, was being ignored. So I stomped into Helms's office and said, how in the hell can the President make that decision in the face of our findings? Dick fixed his eye on me with a sulphurous look. How do I know how he made up his mind? How does any president make any decisions? Maybe Linda Bird was in favor of it. Maybe one of his old Texas friends urged him. Maybe it was something he had just read. Don't ask me to explain the workings of a president's mind. Now, the period leading up to the Six-Day War gives Helms an opportunity to act on two of the very important elements of his intelligence credo. And he often expressed these in catchphrases. One of them was, you only work for one president at a time. In other words, Helms well understood that each president has his own appreciation of intelligence, a very idiosyncratic one, and his own way of dealing with CIA. And a DCI who does not learn to live with those peculiarities will soon render himself irrelevant. The other catchphrase that's germane here is, stay at the table. A DCI, Helms knew, has to remember that fundamentally CIA is a service organization. Its products must be timely and cogent to be of value to the first consumer. And because Helms was so keenly attuned to Johnson's take on the CIA and also had the agency's analytic apparatus in task force mode in May '67, the agency could immediately respond to White House questions about the looming crisis in the Middle East. On the morning of 23 May, President Johnson summoned Helms from a congressional briefing and tasked him with providing an assessment of the increasingly tense Middle East situation. And here's a chance for CIA to seize the day analytically. Only 4 hours later, just in time for one of the Tuesday lunches, Helms has in hand two papers, one called U.S. Knowledge of Egyptian Alert and the other called Overall Arab and Israeli Military Capabilities. He was down outside Walt Rostow's White House office when these items were delivered to him, along with some other items, sit reps, various other products, all put out by the Director of Intelligence's Arab-Israeli Task Force, which had been spun up for weeks and weeks already, putting this stuff out. So there was a lot of on-the-shelf material that could quickly be sliced and diced into these intelligence papers. That second paper I mentioned, which is in the first volume, is the Who Will Win memo. And that's the crucial one. It stated that Israel could, quote, defend successfully against simultaneous Arab attacks on all fronts or hold on any three fronts while mounting successfully a major offensive on the fourth. Now, 2 days later, Tel Aviv muddles this clean intelligence picture by submitting to Washington an estimate that claims the Israeli military was badly outgunned by a Soviet-backed Arab war machine. And I think one insight here may come from something that we may not always appreciate, which is the special intelligence relationship between Israel and Washington conducted by James Angleton on the counterintelligence staff. This is a peculiar situation in which the agency's Near East Operations Division had nothing to do with the Israeli account. It was all handled by Angleton's counterintelligence staff. And this gave, I think, the Israelis a false sense of special entree into high policy-making areas. So they thought here, this late in the day, that they could submit a basically perverse analysis and it would go right to the top, and the White House would listen to it over any other assessments by our own intelligence services. Helms had the Office of National Estimates prepare an appraisal of this Israeli assessment, and it was ready in just 5 hours. The ONE, as it's called, flatly stated that we do not believe the Israeli appreciation is a serious estimate, but probably a gambit intended to influence the U.S. to provide military assistance and make more public commitments to Israel. This is also in the first volume. ONE further concluded that the Soviet aim is still to avoid military involvement and to give the U.S. a black eye among the Arabs by identifying it with Israel. In other words, the Soviets are going to stay out of the conflict and are handling it principally as a diplomatic affair. This is the paper, the ONE rejoinder, about which Dean Rusk said to Helms, if this is a mistake, it's a beaut, and about which the President ordered Helms and JCS Chairman Wheeler to scrub it down, in other words, to create a more formal interagency assessment. Helms returns to Langley and tells the Board of National Estimates to produce such an assessment by the next day. And indeed, it is done that afternoon, military capabilities of Israel and the Arab states. Now, this is the often cited special estimate that appears in a number of descriptions of everything here. It was produced in collaboration with DIA, and this is the one that purportedly called the war right down to how long it would last. Now, a couple of things. It's actually, as you'll see in the volume, not one of the formal SNIEs, Special National Intelligence Estimates. It's basically a typescript memorandum put out very quickly by the BNE in coordination with DIA. And though initial drafts of it said the war wouldn't last more than 7 to 9 days, coordination processes on these estimates being what they are, this kind of fine-tuned judgment usually gets fuzzed a little bit. And so the specificity is sacrificed, and so several days are identified as the time span for Israeli armored forces to breach Egypt's forward lines in the Sinai. Another ONE memo also disputes the idea that Moscow had encouraged Nasser's provocations, and it concluded that the Soviets would not intervene. A senior agency analyst who helped write these papers later remarked, "Rarely has the intelligence community spoken as clearly, as rapidly, and with such unanimity." Informed by these assessments, Johnson declined to airlift special military supplies to Israel or even to publicly support it during the war. He later recalled bluntly telling Foreign Minister Abba Eban, "All of our intelligence people are unanimous that if Egypt attacks, you will whip the hell out of them." Now, having answered one crucial question to the presidents, how would the war end, Helms is in the unique position of being able to warn the president when it's about to begin. According to several published accounts, Helms met on June 1 with the chief of Mossad, Meir Amit, who hinted that Israel could no longer avoid a decision, that it was holding back because of American pressure, but this had caused it to lose the advantage of surprise. Helms interpreted Amit's remarks as suggesting that Israel was going to attack very soon. Moreover, according to Helms, Amit stated clearly that although Israel expected U.S. diplomatic support and the delivery of weapons already promised, it wouldn't request any further support, and it didn't expect any. Then on June 2, Amit abruptly leaves Washington with the Israeli ambassador. That morning, according to published accounts, Helms wrote an eyes-only letter to President Johnson, one item that was not declassified for inclusion in the Frus volume. This document forewarns that Israel will start a war within a few days. On the morning of 5 June at 3 o'clock in the morning, Helms is awakened by a call from the CIA Operations Center. Our Foreign Broadcast Information Service had picked up reports that Israel had launched its preemptive attack. Soon the Office of Current Intelligence concludes that the Israelis fired first, contrary to their claims. And Johnson is very gratified that because of CIA's analysis and Helms's tip, because of the Amit meeting, that he, Johnson, can inform congressional leadership later on the day of the 5th that he had been anticipating Israel's move all along. During the brief war, Helms meets at the White House every day but one, reporting to the NSC and this special committee that Harriet referred to. He brings with him an outpouring of situation reports, 5 of them a day are put out, DI special memoranda, the PDB, which you still can't see, and other analytic products, both agency-generated and requested. In the midst of one of these meetings, Helms recalls, Johnson suddenly fixed his attention on me, sitting in my usual seat at the end of the long table. "Dick," he snapped, "just how accurate is your intelligence on the progress of the war?" Without having a moment to consider the evidence, I shot from the hip, "It's accurate just as long as the Israelis are winning." Now, this may have sounded as if I were smarting off, but it was the exact truth, and it silenced everyone around the table. Only an amused twitch of Dean Acheson's mustache suggested that he had gleaned my reasoning. On 10 June, as Israeli victory appears near, the White House received a message over the hotline from Premier Kosygin foreseeing a grave catastrophe and threatening to take any necessary actions, including military, if the Israelis do not halt their advance across the Golan. Helms is in the Situation Room with several other presidential advisors when this message comes in. Helms remembered the setting in the sit room as unlike the Hollywood version. There were no flashing lights, no elaborate projections of maps and photographs on a big screen, or even any armed guards standing rigidly at attention by the doorway. The room itself was painted a bleak beige and furnished simply with an oval table and an assortment of comfortable chairs. Helms recalled the hush and chill that fell over the room after the translation of Kosygin's message was checked. He writes, "The room went silent as abruptly as if a radio had been switched off. The conversation was conducted in the lowest voices I have ever heard, and it seemed impossible to believe that only 5 years after the missile confrontation in Cuba, the two superpowers had again squared off." On McNamara's recommendation, endorsed by Helms and all others present, Johnson dispatched the Sixth Fleet to the Eastern Mediterranean, a move intended to convey American resolve without backing the Soviets into a corner. Helms told the president that Russian submarines monitoring the fleet's movement would immediately report that it had changed course. Moscow got the message, and then a ceasefire later in the day restored an uneasy peace. Altogether, Helms later said, we had presented the boss with a very tidy package. And there are several circumstances that made this possible that we should keep in mind in any analytics situation, but including the one we're dealing with now in Iraq. First, policymakers asked one clear, basic question: who will win if the U.S. stays out? Analysts were not asked to advance vague, medium, and long-term projections or have to suggest far-flung events into which other occurrences, unforeseen and unpredicted, might intrude. Second, they had hard data, military statistics, and information about known weapon systems to deal with. This wasn't a tea-leaf reading exercise. It wasn't Middle Eastern Kremlinology. It was hard and fast analysis of a straightforward question. And the evidence, third point, was on CIA's side. Israel could not prove its case that it would get whipped. And lastly, the crisis was brief. The time span between the reporting of warning indicators and the playing out of the key judgments was only about 3 weeks, and there wasn't enough time for all the basic issues to get fogged over. So the analysis was made, events transpired, and it just went along a fairly straightforward course. This accomplishment has short-term political benefits for Helms and the agency. From then on, Johnson includes Helms in all of the Tuesday lunches. The DCI had been attending them sporadically since his appointment, but after the Six-Day War, he was assured of what he later called the hottest ticket in town. And it was in these inner sanctum discussions that Helms fulfilled what he regarded as perhaps his greatest responsibility as DCI, seeing that he kept the game honest, another one of his catchphrases, presenting just the facts, just the analyses based on them, and staying out of policy discussions. He said in a 1971 speech, "Without objectivity, there is no credibility, and an intelligence organization without credibility is of little use to those it serves." Now, Johnson appreciated this tough edge to Helms's style, and their good professional rapport helped alleviate some of the tension that the agency's discordant analyses over Vietnam were causing. A few years after leaving the CIA, Helms said of the agency's analysis of the Six-Day War, "When you come as close as that in the intelligence business, it has to be regarded pretty much as a triumph." The CIA's timely and accurate intelligence before and during the Six-Day War had won Helms, literally and figuratively, a place at the president's table, perhaps the most precious commodity that a DCI can possess. And it is also one of the most perishable commodities, and that's a painful lesson that several DCIs since Helms have had to learn to their and the agency's detriment. Thank you.
Thank you. Our camera crew has asked if our speakers can speak from the podium so they can get a better angle. So our next speaker is Dr. David Hatch. He joined the NSA in 1973, holding analytics staff and supervisory positions, and he has now been the NSA historian since 1993. He has a PhD from American University, and he serves now as technical director of the NSA Center for Cryptologic History. Dr. Hatch.
Thank you very much. Glad to stand here and be the first target. I'd like to talk about the recent NSA Liberty releases, what they say, and perhaps as important, what they don't. The devastating Israeli attack on the USS Liberty on June 8, 1967, left 34 Americans dead, 71 wounded, and included among the wounded was the ship's master. Placed the survivors in a desperate position. The vessel itself severely damaged. Due to the heroic efforts of the crew, remained afloat long enough for them to reach a safe haven. The ship itself was beyond repair. The facts that the vessel was not a warship and that it was attacked by a country friendly to the United States added immeasurably to the sense of tragedy, the controversy which has swirled around the incident ever since. Charges, countercharges, and recriminations about the attack have circulated widely in the nearly 4 decades since the attack. All sides agree on the tragic nature of the incident, but agreement stops there. The animosity that pervaded and still pervades most discussions about this incident have been abetted by a number of myths about it. Some of these myths arose and thrived through frequent repetitions, and thrived because countervailing information about the incident remained classified, hence unavailable to scholars, journalists, and other researchers. Some of the arguments and myths have revolved around information allegedly held by the National Security Agency. The author of a recent book on NSA quoted a letter from a military linguist that NSA possessed intercept about the attack, but it was neglected in the bottom of a desk drawer in some NSA component. Since then, both sides on the Liberty argument have claimed this intercept for their own, asserting, sight unseen, that it was evidence for or against the culpability of the Israeli attackers. In July 2003, in response to litigation, the National Security Agency declassified and released the Hebrew language voice intercept, along with translations of the cuts, together with some additional supporting documentation from 1967. My task today is very narrow. I intend only to review the contents of this newly released material, evaluate what it says and what it doesn't. And the basic message of my presentation is like an old good news, bad news joke. The good news is that the information long sought by researchers is now out from under official wraps. The bad news is it doesn't settle much. It turns out that, like many myths, part of this myth was true after all. NSA did hold intercepts related to the aftermath of the attack. These were collected by an automatic search position on an EC-121 aircraft operating in the area, but the nature and importance of this material was not recognized until after the EC-121 had returned to base and its take analyzed. The centerpiece of this material of the release is the intercepted Hebrew language material, snatches of plain language conversation between the Israeli air controller at Hazor, spelled H-A-T-S-O-R in the 1967 version, and 2 helicopters. Releases include transcripts of the written translations prepared at the time. This is the first time, to my knowledge, NSA has released actual voice intercept under the FOIA program. In the first cut among these transcripts, the air controller at Hazor directs 2 helicopters to fly 50 miles to the scene of an attack on a ship. The helicopters are told that the target had been an Egyptian ship. The helicopters in the second and third cuts informed Hazor that they had established visual contact with the vessel from which smoke was rising, that 3 smaller vessels, presumably Israeli motor torpedo boats, were around it. Hazor directed the helicopters to pick up some men from the water, find out their nationality. The helicopters were told to take any survivors to different places depending on whether they spoke Egyptian or English. However, as it turned out, apparently no men were in sight in the water. After a gap, Hazor requested that the helicopters pass by the ship again and confirm whether the vessel was flying an American flag. The intercept does not further address the issue of the flag. And the helicopters were ordered to return to different bases, depending on the quantity of fuel remaining in their tanks. Along with the intercepts and transcripts, NSA released a report issued under SIGINT Readiness Bravo Canyon. The word Bravo indicated the SIGINT system had gone to a second level of alert, for which certain specific actions were prescribed for all parties in the system. And the word canyon was arbitrarily selected to denote the particular crisis to which the system was responding. SIGINT Readiness document in the release merely summarizes the voice material, includes only the briefest of commentary, adding virtually nothing. Finally, NSA reissued a previously released monograph with less text deleted than before. The original was an official history written in 1981 in a predecessor organization to today's Center for Cryptologic History. The monograph tells the Liberty story from the decision to dispatch the ship through the numerous investigations into the attack. Among the materials to emerge in 2003 from the previously official whiteout are the following tidbits. The U.S. SIGINT collection posture before the outbreak of the Six-Day War. The reasons for the decision to deploy the Liberty in the first place. Some of the Liberty's strengths and limitations. Interaction between NSA and the service cryptologic elements. Operational procedures of the Liberty. This is what they say. What do they tell us? Well, this is a rare case in which the mission and targets of a collection platform have been publicly revealed. Restorations of many earlier redactions from the released version of the official history allow a view of the reaction of the U.S. signal intelligence community to an international crisis, a view of that system that is wider and deeper than ever before. This book now constitutes a fine case study of how the intelligence, and particularly the signals intelligence system, deployed and operated a technical research ship to do collection. Given that academic institutions are increasingly offering courses on intelligence history and intelligence practice, this book and the surrounding material has great potential for future use by professors and students alike. Among the interesting nuggets in this release is the fact that the Liberty, contrary to popular myth, was not tasked with monitoring Israeli communications. Although one of the linguists on board had minimal Hebrew training, there were no working Hebrew linguists sailing with the Liberty. This is merely an interesting footnote to the incident. It has, of course, no bearing on the question of the attack or its motivation, since the Israelis could not have known that the Liberty had no means of monitoring their communications in real time. It is sometimes asked whether the absence of any working Hebrew linguists might not have been a blunder contributing to the incident, since it left the Liberty without the capability to detect a threat to itself. While it is true that collection platforms sometimes carry intercept operators to monitor communications for force protection, in the case of the Liberty, who could have foreseen that the ship would be attacked by the forces of a friendly nation? Now, it's obvious to all what the releases do not tell us. There were no intercepted communications related to the Israeli decision to attack the Liberty. In studying the SIGINT evidence, then, we must admit that we cannot learn from it what the higher-ups knew, what they ordered, or why they ordered it. Anything bearing on these questions must come from other sources, wherever they may be found. With the outbreak of the Six-Day War on June 5th, the U.S. Navy commander in Europe instructed the Commander 6th Fleet to position vessels under his command at least 100 miles from the combat zone. Fleet commander issued orders to that effect later in the day. Questions linger about why then the Liberty was allowed to remain in very close proximity to the combat zone. Although the newly released materials offer some discussion about the proper location to station the Liberty for its mission, materials relate strictly to technical and mission-related issues and have no bearing on the withdrawal orders for U.S. Navy vessels or the misrouted orders for the Liberty to get out. To the best of my knowledge, NSA has no additional information bearing on the positioning of the 6th Fleet or the miscommunications that left the Liberty in an exposed position. If the intercepts fail to answer the big one, they still have value regarding subsidiary questions. While falling short of proof, the intercepts, to me, suggest strongly that the Israeli attackers did not know they were aiming deadly fire at a vessel belonging to the United States. In a careful reading, the intercepted communications between the air controller at Hazor and helicopters dispatched in the wake of the attack show a progressive reversal of perception on their part. At first, confidence the aircraft were to inspect an Egyptian ship, then signs that the ship might not be Egyptian after all, and finally, growing evidence that it could belong to a friendly nation. The packet of newly released Liberty materials has a larger meaning for researchers, well beyond the Liberty incident. It should be a prime tool in demolishing one of the other long-cherished myths held by some academics, journalists, and possibly even some senior government officials, that signals intelligence organizations collect all, know all, and could reveal all if only somehow persuaded or compelled to release what they hold. I think we are prisoners of a myth born of the way in which previously declassified cryptologic materials have been released and used. Particularly, I think here, the World War II collections. The impressive impact of SIGINT during that conflict and others has led historians to emphasize successful campaigns or actions where SIGINT made a difference. We have paid less attention to the products and materials that are workaday, those that failed to answer the key questions, and those that did not in their own time produce immediate or discernible results. The newly released signals intelligence does not answer the questions we wish it would. If there is fault, however, it lies not in the SIGINT itself, but in the questions put to it. Our task as scholars is to study the important nuances the material adds to our knowledge of the incident and strive to understand the reality of the incident shorn of the myths. Perhaps the proverbial bottom line concerning the releases on the Liberty incident and for SIGINT in general is a paraphrase of the old motto that if we cannot get exactly what we want, we must learn to use what we can get. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hatch. Our next speaker is Judge Jay Cristol, who served as a naval aviator for 18 years, later served in the Pentagon. In 1985, he accepted appointment as a federal judge and is now the Chief Judge of the U.S. Bankruptcy Court in the Southern District of Florida. He has a Ph.D. in International Studies from the University of Miami, and his publications include The Liberty Incident, the 1967 attack on the U.S. Navy spy ship. Judge Cristol?
Thank you, Dr. Susser. It's an honor to be here. I've learned that some of the Liberty crew survivors are here. In fact, I see my friend Joe Lentini sitting in the back. Joe, why don't you stand up? And are there any other Liberty crew members here? If they are, I'd appreciate them to stand, and we should all recognize them as heroes, men who served in the armed forces. They did their duty, they earned their Purple Hearts and Silver Stars, and their skipper earned the Medal of Honor, and we should honor and respect them. Now, I have spent 16 years researching this matter, and I produced my book, The Liberty Incident, which I am not able to completely condense and explain to you in 15 minutes allotted. However, if you are interested in my research and what I was able to accomplish and how I happened to get involved in the first place and what path I took to come to my conclusions, I refer you to my dissertation at the University of Miami, which is on file in the Library of Congress, also titled The Liberty Incident. The book itself is available. A quicker reference is on the website. You can look at my website, thelibertyincident.com, and there you will find scanned in the images of many, many documents that the publisher did not feel could fit into a 300-page book. I urge you, if you're interested, to look at some of these original documents rather than to rely on what may be newspaper reports about them or other information about them. When the State Department announced this conference, they indicated they were interested in a paper on the Liberty Incident and the role of intelligence. That was just a narrow portion of the focus of my research, but I thought that in order to make it as authentic and as interesting as possible, that I would invite two co-authors for my paper. I did so. The first one was Captain Ernest Castle, who served as the naval attaché in Israel in 1967 and who was in charge of our overt intelligence gathering at that time. Captain Castle was the one to whom the Israelis delivered the message, "We've mistakenly attacked your ship." He's the one who sent the message that went to the White House, to the Sixth Fleet, and to Kasinkas Navyur and so on, advising that the Israelis had notified us that we've attacked your ship and that they send their abject apologies. And he also accompanied me to Israel on the 25th anniversary of the tragedy. And on that day, I was able to get an airplane and flew Captain Castle and his wife out to the spot where he had 25 years before reached the Liberty in an Israeli helicopter, the first U.S. officer to get to the ship after the tragedy. We flew out there almost to the minute of the time he was there, and we dropped 34 flowers into the water in memory of those who were lost that terrible day. In addition to Captain Castle, whose job was overt intelligence, I invited John Haddon, who was the CIA chief of station in Tel Aviv in 1967. He also joined my paper, and I think that you'll find as their appendixes to the paper, very interesting reading, some very, very interesting observations. On one point, John Haddon and I disagree on what President Nasser was thinking, but that's a minor point in the story. John Haddon was, as I say, the CIA chief of station. Then he went back to the United States and served in the CIA headquarters on the Israel desk for 8 years. And on the 2nd of August, 1967, he, I, and my friend Bill McGonigal, the now deceased skipper of the Liberty, had a very interesting three-way conference call in which John Haddon was able to answer a number of Bill's questions. Both Captain Castle and his wife Jeannie, and John Haddon and his wife Betty are here. And Dr. Susser said that at the Q&A portion that we'll introduce them. And if those of you in the media have any questions for them, they've indicated they are willing to talk to you. Now, immediately after the attack, as Mr. Robarge had mentioned, the first report came out from the CIA, and that was only 5 days later. And quite frankly, I'm very pleased because when I wrote this book, the National Security Agency had not yet released its material, and the State Department's stuff that's coming out this afternoon, which you've heard described, was still a mystery or a secret. And when the NSA stuff came out, it dovetailed with everything I said in my book. There's no discrepancies. Down to the minute of the time when the Israelis first observed the U.S. flag 44 minutes after the attacks were over. And having heard the synopsis of what I heard this morning, everything that is in the State Department book seems to fit perfectly, as far as I can determine at this point, with what I did in my own research. The Navy convened a court of inquiry, and it didn't get its work done for several days after. The president of that court of inquiry was Isaac C. Kidd, Jr., and that court of inquiry completed its work and issued its report. The report was sent to the Commander-in-Chief, Naval Forces Europe, Admiral John McCain. John McCain looked at that report and noticed that, and I would like to point out that the media somehow is not deficient in accurately reporting the findings of that court of inquiry. There were 52 findings. The most significant, finding number 1, said it was a mistake. Finding number 6 said there's no indication that they had any knowledge they were attacking a U.S. ship. And there are the other 50 findings that are very interesting. And the media usually comes up with some comment that the findings of the report were inconclusive. It's not so. Read the report. If you want to see it, just go down to the Navy Yard. It's in the JAG office there. You can buy it. You can read it there. Or if you'd like to see the entire report, it's on my website, thelibertyincident.com. It scanned in all 727 pages, including 155 pages of sworn testimony of the Liberty survivors given a few days after the attack. And one of the interesting portions of that testimony is that on the first day when Captain McGonigal, then Commander McGonigal, testified, Admiral Kidd said to him, "Now, Captain, I want you to go back and gather the remainder of your crew around you and go over everything that you can remember and make up a chronology of what happened out there that day and bring it back to me and put it into the court record tomorrow." On the second day, you'll see it there. McGonigal came back. He had assembled his crew. He'd gotten comments from everyone, and they read that into the record, and then they typed it into the record. And this is, I think, the best study of the Liberty incident, although the CIA, the NSA, Clark Clifford, numerous other studies have been made. That report, as I said, was given to Admiral John McCain, Commander-in-Chief, Naval Forces Europe. And he put the fifth endorsement on it. And in paragraph 15 of that fifth endorsement, he said, "The foregoing comments by the convening authority lead to the overall conclusion that the attack was in fact a mistake." That report with Admiral McCain, oh, and incidentally, for those of you who are not familiar, Admiral John McCain is the father of Senator McCain, who read my book and said, "I commend Judge Cristol for his thoroughness and fairness, and I commend this work." That report then went on through 7 endorsements, one of which was from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. Now, the Chief of Naval Operations at the time of the attack was David McDonald, but he was replaced on the 1st of August, 53 days later, by Admiral Thomas Moorer. And Admiral Moorer's office put the 3rd endorsement on it. I have it right here. And he concluded the endorsement by saying that that report should be retained for historical purposes. Since then, Admiral Moorer has changed his mind about those conclusions. I can't tell you why. I had heard he'd be here today and perhaps to ask a question and explain it, but I don't see him in the audience. In any event, the report is an excellent report, and I commend you to it, but it has recently come under attack. On the 22nd of October, Ward Boston, the captain who served as the counsel for the court, prepared an affidavit, a very unusual affidavit for a naval officer, in which he said that he didn't speak the truth under his oath, which he took when he was sworn in to serve on the court, and that the fact of the matter was that President Johnson and Secretary McNamara had ordered Admiral Kidd to make a false report, and that's what Admiral Kidd did. I was distressed at this because Admiral Kidd died in 1999, and Admiral Kidd was a friend of mine. And I felt that this was not an appropriate thing to dishonor, make such an allegation dishonoring the memory of a great naval officer. And I took no other action but than write a letter saying so, which was published in the Navy Times. However, you heard Dr. Susser remark that there were some people passing out material here today, and so I don't know how many of you have got this updated statement of Ward Boston, signed, I believe, on Friday of this week. And he has repeated the allegations that he made in that October 22nd affidavit, where he admitted that he has not told the truth under oath, and that he signed a false report under oath, and now he says the attack he knows was a mistake. But in this affidavit, if you look at paragraphs 22 and 23, those of you who have it, he says some very interesting things about me. He says that Admiral Kidd called him to inquire who I was, that my claim of friendship with Admiral Kidd is incredible, that it's impossible to believe what I said Admiral Kidd has said, and that Admiral Kidd told him that he thought I was an Israeli agent, and that Admiral Kidd never said anything about me that wasn't a disparaging remark. Well, I was a little distressed at that, and so I picked up the phone and called Angelique Kidd, Admiral Kidd's widow, and spoke to her on Saturday. And she authorized me to release personal correspondence between me and the Kidd family. And I have a package over here for those of you in the press that might want to get copies of, for one thing, a letter, a personal letter from Admiral Kidd in his own handwriting to me, which says, which completely contradicts everything in this affidavit. And I'm down to 2 minutes. There's so much more I'd like to tell you, but I hope you'll get a chance. Also, I brought with me a couple hundred copies of the picture of Admiral Kidd that hangs in my office with the inscription on it. I'd like each of you to, if you care to pick up a copy and read the inscription, and you can decide whether he made a disparaging remark about me and the affidavit is correct, or whether perhaps the question that you need to decide is, Boston already admits that he has not told the truth under oath. The question is, was he not telling the truth under oath in 1967 or now? One last thing, I'd point out that I also contacted the NSA linguist who was aboard the EC-121 who made those recordings that Dr. Hatch talked to you about. He's teaching a college course tonight and declined my invitation to be here, but he told me to send you his greetings and to tell Mr. Bamford that Mr. Bamford, he said that in his book, got it all wrong, that Bamford said the opposite of what he told them, and he said to tell Mr. Bamford to look at his letter published in the Wall Street Journal Wednesday, May 15, 2001, in which he said, my position is the opposite of that which Bamford wrote about. Take a look at the Wall Street Journal. So much more to tell you, and perhaps we can cover more of it in the questions. But it's been an honor to be here, and I'm sure that this conference will be enlightening to all of you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is James Bamford, and I would like to correct one point in the biography that was handed out. Mr. Bamford is not retired. He is still an active writer, which I think is a very good thing for all of us. He has written 2 very well-received books and several very important newspaper articles. The first book about the NSA that he wrote, The Puzzle Palace, a report on NSA, America's most secret agency, back in 1982, and his most recent book on the agency, Body of Secrets, Anatomy of the Ultra-Secret National Security Agency, also was widely reviewed. He has spent many years as a Washington investigative producer for ABC News with Peter Jennings, and he has written investigative cover stories for the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times magazines. Mr. Bamford.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate your introduction. As Mark said, I'm an investigative writer, reporter. I've been one for a long time. Going back a long ways here in Washington, I wrote the cover story on the Iran-Contra affair for the New York Times Magazine back in the 80s. And remember, we were going to put trying to put somebody interesting on the cover, so we were going to put the new head of the National Security Council, Frank Carlucci, who was coming in there to reorganize the whole place after the scandal. And I got an exclusive interview with Carlucci, and I went up to his office. He was still working at Sears at the time. It was before he went to the White House. So when I was up there, there was a colonel up there, and he was helping move boxes. And while I was waiting for to go in to interview Carlucci, I helped move a few of these boxes, and then he introduced himself, and I said it was Colonel Colin Powell. So I'm probably the only person here that's helped Colin Powell move boxes, I guess. And he's gone a long way. He's a lot further than I've gone since that time, but I greatly admired him from that time on. In the course of writing investigative pieces, doing investigative stories for ABC News and so forth. One of the things that's always interested me was how investigations were conducted. And I've followed a lot of them from Iran-Contra, and then I covered the White House scandals under Clinton, all those scandals. So I've been overseas doing investigations, so I know a little bit about investigations and how they're done. And I know what should go into an investigation. One of the things that has not gone into this investigation, the USS Liberty, is any kind of semblance of any kind of realistic investigation. You'll have people that will tell you there's been 20 investigations. I'll tell you there hasn't been one investigation. An investigation is when you take people from that are independent and send them to both sides and get interviews. You get documents. You send subpoenas out. You get people under oath. That's what an investigation is. That was never done with the USS Liberty. It was done with the USS Cole. It was done when the Cole was attacked over in off Yemen. It was certainly done with the attack on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. It was done when the Khobar Towers were blown up in Saudi Arabia. Those were investigations. There were FBI agents put on planes. They were flown there, the Libyan government, Saudi government, and the Tanzanian and Kenyan governments all let the people in and let them ask questions, and they came up with answers. Whether they were conclusive or not is sort of beside the point. The point was that they actually, United States government, sent people over there to do an investigation. That was never done with the USS Liberty. I mean, we could spend 3 days here talking about the fine points of did they see this at what time, or what time did this plane fly over, or what not. Briefly, these are the details. The USS Liberty, and the reason I'm here and the reason I'm talking about this was because my second book on NSA, Body of Secrets, contains an entire chapter on the USS Liberty, since it was the most serious loss of life in NSA's history. I mean, the basic facts are this. You have this enormous ship, the USS Liberty. It sails 12.5 miles off the coast of the Sinai to pick up intelligence, pick up signals intelligence from what was going on the Sinai. What they were basically looking for was Russian involvement. They weren't really interested in either the Egyptians or the Israelis that much, except to the fact that the Russians were involved. That's the principal reason that the ship was sent there. While it was there, the Israelis surveyed the ship considerably. This is a State Department report. At 5:15 in the morning, 8:50, 10:30, 10:56, 11:26, 11:45, 12:20, and 12:45, they sent planes over to surveil this ship. Later on, after the planes sent the messages back to the headquarters looked up the identity of the ship. The person that was here at the headquarters actually looked it up in Jane's fighting ship. They found the number, GTR-5. So at one point, headquarters in the Israeli Navy knew that this was the USS Liberty. The question comes, what happened then? And that's not debated. I mean, this person's actually talked on television, the person who looked it up at Jane's. The question happens, what happened then? What did the Israelis do? The Israelis said it was a mistake. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. There's never been an investigation, and that's the problem. And that's what needs to be done. For 40 years, there wasn't an investigation. I think this is the time. I mean, any time's the time since the last 40 years, but certainly now that this conference is drawing some attention to it, maybe now there can be some investigation into what really happened, so you don't have people getting up here giving their opinions. So we can clarify things here in terms of how we got to where we are. We got to where we are because of cover-ups. People cover things up. I wouldn't be in business doing the work I do if governments didn't cover things up. I'd be getting some other kind of employment. But I've worked for 20 years, going into Iran-Contra, going into the White House, going to all these places, looking at people, covering things up. It happens. There was a big cover-up on this. One of the things that just came out was Ward Boston, who was the legal counsel. He was the guy basically in charge of the investigation that Judge Cristol put so much weight in. into. The one that supposedly came out and said it was a mistake. Well, let me tell you a little bit about that Court of Inquiry, the Navy Court of Inquiry. Actually, I won't tell you about it. Ward Boston will tell you about it. I'll read his affidavit. For more than 30 years, I remained silent, and this is a signed affidavit under oath and so forth. For more than 30 years, I have remained silent on the topic of the USS Liberty. I am a military man, and when orders come in from the Secretary of Defense and President of the United States, I follow them. However, recent attempts to rewrite history compel me to share the truth. In June of 1967, while serving as a captain in the Judge Advocate General Corps, United States Navy, I was assigned as senior legal counsel for the Navy's Court of Inquiry into the brutal attack on the USS Liberty, which had occurred on June 8th. The late Admiral Isaac C. Kidd, president of the court, and I were given only 1 week to gather evidence for the Navy's official investigation into the attack, despite the fact that we both had estimated that the proper court of inquiry into the attack of this magnitude would take at least 6 months to conduct. Admiral John S. McCain, Jr., then Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Naval Forces Europe, at his headquarters in London, had charged Admiral Kidd to inquire into all the pertinent facts and circumstances leading to and connected with the armed attack, damage resulting therefrom, and deaths and injuries to naval personnel. Despite the short amount of time we were given, we gathered a vast amount of evidence, including hours of heartbreaking testimony from the young survivors. The evidence was clear. Both Admiral Kidd and I believed with certainty that this attack, which killed 34 American sailors and injured 172 others, 2 of them are here today, and they should be on the panel. I don't know why they aren't. We have 2 people representing Israel and nobody from the Liberty. 34 American sailors killed and...
Excuse me. Please remain quiet.
This attack, which killed 34 American sailors and injured 172 others, was a deliberate effort to sink an American ship and murder its entire crew. Each evening, after hearing all testimony all day, we often spoke in our private thoughts concerning what we had seen and heard. I recall Admiral Kidd repeatedly referring to the Israeli forces responsible for the attack as, quote, murderous bastards, unquote. It was our shared belief, based on the documentary evidence and testimony we received firsthand, that the Israeli attack was planned and deliberate and could not possibly have been an accident. I am certain that the Israeli pilots that undertook the attack, as well as their superiors who had ordered the attack, were well aware of the ship was American. I saw the flag, which had visibly identified the ship as American, riddled with bullet holes, and heard testimony that made it clear that the Israelis intended there to be no survivors. Not only did the Israelis attack the ship with napalm gunfire and missiles, the Israeli torpedo boats machine gunned 3 lifeboats that had been launched in an attempt by the crew to save the most seriously wounded, a war crime. Admiral Kidd and I both felt necessary to travel to Israel to interview the Israelis who took part in the attack. Admiral Kidd telephoned Admiral McCain to discuss making the arrangements. Admiral Kidd later told me that Admiral McCain was adamant that we were not to travel to Israel or contact the Israelis concerning this matter. Regrettably, we did not receive information, or we did not receive into evidence, and the court did not consider any of the more than 60 witnesses' declarations from men who had been hospitalized and were able to testify in person, and were unable to testify in person. I'm sorry. I am outraged at the efforts of the apologists for Israel in this country to claim that this attack was a case of mistaken identity. Again, this is the words of the person who did the Naval Court of Inquiry report. In particular, the recent publication of Jay Cristol's book, The Liberty Incident, twists the facts and misrepresents the views of those of us who investigated the attack. It is Cristol's insidious attempt to whitewash the facts that has pushed me to speak out on this. One side note, when the Israeli report was released on this incident, the Deputy Director of the National Security Agency used those same words when he wrote on the top of the report, a nice whitewash. And asking Israel to investigate themselves on this is a little bit like asking Enron to investigate themselves on an investigation. Going back to Boston, he says, I know from personal conversation I had with Admiral Kidd that President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered him to conclude that the attack was a case of, quote, mistaken identity, unquote, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Admiral Kidd told me, after returning from Washington, that he had been ordered to sit down with two civilians from either the White House or the Defense Department and rewrite portions of the court's findings. Admiral Kidd also told me that he had been ordered to, quote, put the lid on, unquote, on everything having to do with the attack on USS Liberty. We were never to speak of it, and we were cautioned that everyone else involved that they can never speak of it again. I have no reason to doubt the accuracy of that statement, as I know that the Court of Inquiry transcript that has been released to the public is not the same one that I certified and sent off to Washington. I know this because it was necessary due to the exigencies of the time to hand correct an initial substantial numbers of pages. I have examined the release version of the transcript, and I did not see any pages that bore my hand correction initials or initials. Also, the original did not have any deliberately blank pages as the release version did. Finally, the testimony of Lieutenant Painter concerning the deliberate machine gunning of the life rafts by the Israeli torpedo boat crews, which I distinctly recall being given at the Court of Inquiry and included in the original transcript, is now missing and has been excised. Following the conclusion of the Court of Inquiry, Admiral Kidd and I remained in contact. Though we never spoke of the attack in public, we did discuss it between ourselves on occasion. Every time we discussed the attack, Admiral Kidd was adamant that it was a deliberate planned attack on an American ship. In 1990, I received a telephone call from Jay Cristol, who wanted to interview me concerning the functioning of the Court of Inquiry. I told him that I would not speak to him on the subject and prepared to hang up the telephone. Cristol then began asking me about my personal background and other non-Court of Inquiry related matters. I endeavored to answer these questions and politely extricate myself from the conversation. Cristol continued to return to the subject of the Court of Inquiry, which I refused. And finally, I suggested that he contact Admiral Kidd and ask him about the Court of Inquiry. Shortly after my conversation with Cristol, I received a telephone call from Admiral Kidd inquiring about Cristol and what he was up to. The Admiral spoke of Cristol in disparaging terms and even opined that Cristol must be an Israeli agent. It's in quotes. Cristol must be an Israeli agent, in quotes. I don't know if he meant that literally or it was his way of expressing his disgust for Cristol's highly partisan pro-Israeli approach to questions involving the USS Liberty. At no time did I ever hear Admiral Kidd speak of Cristol other than in highly disparaging terms. I find Cristol's claims of a, quote, close relationship, unquote, with Admiral Kidd to be utterly incredible. I also find it impossible to believe that the statements he attributes to Admiral Kidd concerning the attack on the Liberty, or believe the words he has concerning the attack on the Liberty. There's a little bit more here. You can read it in the handout versions. My time is just about at one last comment here. And, you know, we could talk more about these things and question and answers if you want. This is not an isolated case. The director of the National Security Agency said when I interviewed him, there is no other answer than it was deliberate. And CIA Director Richard Helms, who I also interviewed and who told me and who's recently come out publicly and said this before he died, it was no accident. I had no role in the Board of Inquiry that followed, nor the CIA's board's findings that there could be no doubt that the Israelis, there could be no doubt that the Israelis knew exactly what they were doing when they attacked the Liberty. I have yet to understand why it was felt necessary to attack the ship or who ordered the attack. And there are many, many more comments from deputy directors of NSA and so forth that come to the same conclusion. So in over 20 years of doing investigative reporting, I have never once seen an instance where there is more need for a full U.S. investigation at this point. Thank you very much.
Now, our next speaker is Michael Oren, who is a senior fellow at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem, where he has the Middle East History Project. He has numerous scholarly publications to his credit on the history and politics of the Middle East, including he is the author of a very well-received book, 6 Days of War, June 1967, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, which came out in 2002. Dr. Oren?
Thank you, Mark. Let me begin by saying that my book is also on sale. A representative of my publisher is waiting outside the State Department right now in the cold, ready to take your orders. Now that we've taken off the gloves a little bit about the Liberty incident, let me disappoint you somewhat by replacing them for the most part. I want to talk about my academic research into the Liberty incident. 4 years ago, as part of my work on the 1967 war in general, I set out to write a separate article on the Liberty incident, the attack, as you've heard repeatedly this morning, on an American warship in which 34 American servicemen tragically lost their lives and 171 were wounded. The incident was certainly one of the most controversial in the entire history of the Six-Day War. It was also one of the least researched of that period, and I thought it deserved a separate analysis. As primary materials, I was able to draw on several dozen declassified documents then from the American archives, on several hundred pages from the Israeli archives, including the findings of 2 official investigations and an internal IDF report, as well as supplementary materials such as the minutes of the U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry. And having read several hundred pages of that transcript, I can find no reason to doubt the veracity and integrity of that holding, as well as the diplomatic summaries of the war compiled by the State Department, the White House, and the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Now, as many of these communications are dated to the exact time of day, I was able to arrange these documents chronologically and to reconstruct, in a rather archaeological fashion, a minute-by-minute reconstruction of the entire Liberty incident. My evaluations strive to be, to the degree attainable by any historian, and without stooping to the level of responding to the charge that I'm a spokesman of the State of Israel, I will not dissemble that I am an Israeli, but the degree that it is possible for anybody, member of any nation, to achieve balance and objectivity, I certainly strove to do so in this report. I also had to leave aside a painful personal incident in my life. I'm also a survivor of a severe case of friendly fire, one of the worst in Israel's military history, that occurred 15 years to the date after the Liberty incident. In June 1982, I was part of a paratrooper, interesting Freudian slip, a paratrooper armored column that was attacked in broad daylight by Israeli jets. The armored column was clearly marked by Israeli flags, and 20 of my friends were killed in that attack. With this in mind, my conclusions were nevertheless categorical. I found no evidence whatsoever to suggest that the Liberty incident was anything other than a tragic accident between allies, a mistake resulting from serious errors on both sides, and a mistake thus was, moreover, easily avoidable. Now, relative to other incidents in the Six-Day War, the Battle for Jerusalem, for example, the Liberty incident was rather easily reconstructed. The Liberty arrived at 8:49 exactly on the morning of June 8th, the 4th day of the Six-Day War, off the coast of El Arish, distance of 12.5 miles, which was barely outside of Egyptian territorial waters, but was well within the war zone. The Liberty, again, as we've heard, was a signals intelligence vessel or spy ship, lightly armed, but equipped with sophisticated eavesdropping facilities. It was attached to the U.S. Sixth Fleet. The ship, though, was in fact operating under the direct instructions of the National Security Agency. Its exact mission, which as far as I know still remains classified, was not to spy from Israel. Dr. Hatch went into that in depth. There were, as we've heard, no certified Hebrew linguists aboard, but rather Russian and Arabic translators. Thus, the ship's mission was probably outdated by the time it arrived in the war zone, as both Egyptian soldiers and their Russian advisors had long before retreated from the area of El Arish. Prior to arriving in the sea, however, no less than 5 messages had been sent to the Liberty, ordering it to pull back to a distance of at least 100 miles from the war zone. But due to complications in the Navy's rather overcomplicated transmission system, these messages did not reach the Liberty in time. It is therefore questionable whether anybody in Washington knew where the Liberty was at this point. It is clear that President Johnson did not know where the Liberty was. He thought it was 100 miles away. The Israelis, moreover, did not know that the Liberty had entered their waters. We are honored by the presence today here of Captain Castle, who was then the U.S. Naval Attaché in Tel Aviv. He was not informed of the Liberty's arrival. The Johnson administration had also repeatedly turned down Israel's request for a naval liaison office which would have reported on the arrival of such a ship. Instead, the Liberty entered into a dogleg patrol pattern, turning west toward Port Said and then returning in the opposite direction east toward Gaza. Several Israeli aircraft would indeed pass over the ship during the course of the morning, some at very low altitudes, but most of these were not surveillance or observation aircraft. These were cargo planes, and they did not report on the Liberty's presence. One plane did sight the ship at 5:55 a.m., reporting seeing what the pilot believed to be a U.S. supply ship with the hull designation GTR-5, situated 70 miles from Gaza. Consequently, officers on duty at the Israel Naval Headquarters had their war board, had their war table. They placed a neutral marker on that board. They didn't know the identity of the ship until they heard that the markings were GTR-5. And then they looked it up, as we've heard, in James Fighting Ship's Manual, and they saw that this was the U.S. spy ship, the Liberty. And they changed the marker then from a neutral color to green, meaning a friendly vessel. There was a second sighting at 9 a.m. when an Israeli jet reported seeing, quote, a gray bulky ship 20 miles north of El Arish. Neither sighting reported seeing a flag. It's simply a fact. It's in the record. There were no other official sightings of the ship until after 11 a.m. in the morning, when the chief engineer coming on duty, chief officer coming on duty at the Israeli Naval Headquarters, seeing that the most recent report on the Liberty was 2 hours old, removed that green neutral marker, because this was standard operating procedure in the Israeli Navy. They felt it better to have no information about a ship, because ships don't stay in place, they move, rather than to have inaccurate information. Right? But the basic fact remained that as far as the state of Israel was concerned, the USS Liberty no longer existed. That moment, almost precisely 11:24 in the morning, Israeli infantry near the beach at El Arish reported that they had come under fire from an Egyptian destroyer offshore. A similar shelling had occurred the day before. It was not an unreasonable conclusion. In fact, the explosions they heard were from an Egyptian ammo depot that had gone up in flames. But the Israeli soldiers looked offshore. They saw the silhouette of a military ship not too far, and they concluded that they were being shelled by the ship. And the Southern Command of the Israeli Army reported this finding to the Navy, which at 12:05 in the afternoon dispatched 3 torpedo boats, codenamed Pagoda, sent out to intercept what they thought was an Egyptian ship, which they did just as the Liberty turned. It turned from sailing in the direction of Gaza to the direction of Port Said, and now you have a situation where you have what the Israelis believe is an Egyptian ship, having finished its shelling, trying to get back home to Port Said. At 1:41 in the afternoon, at a distance of 22 miles, the Israelis made visual contact with the ship, and using the rather primitive systems of the day, they twice miscalculated its speed. Liberty had a maximum speed of 18 knots. It was actually sailing at around 5 knots. The Israelis' calculation or miscalculation put it at 30 knots. That was a speed then attainable only by warships. And sensitive to Israel's rather vulnerable coastal area, the Israeli Army and Navy before the war had issued a general order that any unidentified ship sailing off the coast of the war zone at a speed exceeding 20 knots was to be sunk. Now, based on the Liberty's miscalculated speed, however, the Navy also concluded that its torpedo boats could not catch up with the boat before it reached Port Said, and therefore the Navy turned to the Air Force. The Air Force had no available jets, but 2 Mirages were just then returning from a combat air patrol over Sinai, and they were instructed to check it out. What the pilots saw was a, quote, gray boat with 2 guns in the forecastle, a mast, and a funnel, unquote. The Israeli ground controllers talking to the pilots repeatedly inquired about the identification of the ship. They asked whether it had a white cross on its deck that would have indicated it was an Israeli ship. They repeatedly asked about a flag. The answer to both questions was no. At 1:45 in the afternoon, therefore, the order was given to attack the ship. The Jeps were not armed for air-to-sea combat. They had no iron bombs that would have sunk the ship immediately. They had only napalm and cannon. They severely peppered the ship. The napalm set the deck of the ship alight. The Israeli Mirages were then joined by a brace of Mysteers, and they joined in the attack, which altogether lasted about 14 minutes. At no time, and this is important to note, at no time did the crew of the Liberty identify their aerial attackers as Israeli. In fact, most of them thought it was an Egyptian plane making the attack. Finally, one of the Israeli pilots, noticing the ship was not firing back, strange, went in for a closer look. He still saw no flag, but he did notice Latin letters on the hull, which was unusual because Egyptian warships usually have Arabic letters on their hull. And the Air Force, hearing this, immediately called off the attack and sent helicopters in to look for survivors. But this conclusion never reached the Israeli Navy. There was a complete breakdown in communications between the Israeli Air Force and the Israeli Navy. And 20 minutes later, at 2:24 in the afternoon, the torpedo boats arrived on the scene. Now, the commander of the lead torpedo boat, whose name was Major Oren, no relation to this author, later testified that he tried to contact the ship, and the American commander of the ship, Captain McGonigal, later testified that his signal lamp had been shot out, and he could not respond to that request. So the Israeli boats came in for a closer look. At this point, the boat was shrouded in thick, dark smoke. The Israeli commander consulted his intelligence manual, and what he could make out of the silhouette of the burning ship conformed to what the intelligence manual told him was that of the Egyptian transporter El Qusir. Still, the Israeli torpedo boats held their fire until at least 1 and perhaps 2 of the Liberty's 50 caliber machine guns opened fire on the Israeli torpedo boats. So now you have a ship which appears to be heading toward Port Said, which appears to conform to the silhouette of the Al Qusir, firing on the Israelis, and the Israelis went in for the attack. They attacked the boat with machine gun fire, raking not just its lifeboats, but the entire boat, and they fired 5 torpedoes at the ship. One of them hit amidships, striking the NSA intelligence compartment and causing the maximum number of damage. Then, as the Israeli torpedo boats crossed leeward of the Liberty, the captain of the ship noticed signs that the ship was American, including the flag, and they suspended the attack immediately, offered help, which was declined. The Israelis immediately admitted their mistakes to the White House, as we've heard. They apologized. They later paid $12 million in compensation to the families of the victims. The White House, upon hearing of this incident, immediately determined to keep a low profile on the incident, not to placate Israel's supporters in the Congress or anywhere else, as has been alleged, but because, again, as we've heard today, there was at the time a claim that U.S. aircraft and ships were actively aiding the Israelis, and to admit that an American warship was off the coast of the war zone would seem to support that allegation by the Arabs. Israel then conducted 2 internal investigations. The second one was a full judiciary inquiry. They identified Israel's main mistakes, from the removal of the markers on the war table, to the miscalculation of Liberty's speed, to the breakdown in communication between the Air Force and the Navy. Also noted were the Army's exhaustion after 4 days of nonstop combat, the rather over-eagerness of the Navy after earlier disappointing show in the war. Taking all these factors into account, the Israeli court found that the errors committed though unfortunate, were reasonable in a combat situation and not criminally negligent in nature. Now, the result, as we've heard, disappointed many in the Johnson administration who wanted to see full courts-martials, wanted to see some heads rolling. The U.S. conducted several investigations, beginning with the Naval Court of Inquiry, that concluded that the Liberty's flag could not possibly be seen from the air, and the attack was, quote-unquote, a case of mistaken identity. Now, these were my findings. I believed them at the time unassailable, and I wrote my article, and I entitled it, USS Liberty, Case Closed. Apparently, I was premature. You type in the USS Liberty on your internet browser, and you'll receive dozens of sites dedicated to proving that the incident was an Israeli conspiracy, a case of, very close, a case of cold-blooded murder and a subsequent cover-up. The sites are on the main, posted by a range of hate groups and religious extremists, but there are also sites, as well as books by less peripheral authors, positing similar conspiracy theories. These break down to two types. There's an Arab theory, which appeared in the immediate aftermath of the war, and it's persisted to this day, and it holds that the Liberty was spying for the Israelis, but the Israelis, acting nefariously, attacked it anyway. There is a theory that the Liberty was spying for the Arabs, and therefore had to be silenced. And finally, there's a theory that the Liberty had somehow honed on some atrocious Israeli activity, again forcing Israel to eliminate it. Common to all these theories is the rejection of Israel's contention that the Israelis failed to record the Liberty's presence, failed to see a flag, or failed to correctly gauge the ship's speed. After all, the theorists asked, Israel had just won a brilliant war. How could they make such mistakes, the theorists? All right, a question they probably wouldn't ask 6 years later in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, or indeed in the aftermath of much of Israel's military activity since then. All of the conspiracy theories ignore two fundamental facts relevant to the Liberty incident. First of all is the extreme porousness of Israeli society, and the impossibility of keeping much of anything secret in that country after any length of time, certainly a shared secret by a great number of people after 36 years. Secondly, and more substantively, the paramount role of American opinion in Israeli policymaking is completely ignored by conspiracy theorists. A good third of my book is dedicated to showing how Israeli leaders in 1967 were willing to jeopardize the security and even the existence of the State of Israel in order to keep in tandem with American policy. The notion that Israel would discard all that hard-won goodwill and risk an armed clash with its only superpower ally in the middle of a war in which the Soviet Union was likely to intervene contradicts everything we know about Israeli strategic thinking. Such a deed would, in fact, for the Jewish state, be suicidal. Why then, the theorists never ask, why, if Israel wanted to destroy this ship, why did it refrain from doing so, and in the end, offer the ship assistance? Why did the Israelis attack the ship with clearly marked Israeli planes and boats, and then allow the ship to survive? In the period since I conducted my research, new evidence has come to light on the Liberty incident, all of which I believe confirm my initial findings. The IDF released its transcripts of the attacks. I was actually privileged to listen to the tapes, a very troubling experience, but informative. The NSA has released its own partial transcripts of the recording, and to the degree that they overlap with the Israeli transcripts, they confirm the substance of the Israeli transcripts. Both sources show that the Israelis believed they were attacking an Egyptian ship and ceased firing the minute they identified the vessel as American. There is also the written testimony of Professor Marvin Dewicki, who as Judge Cristol mentioned, was the Hebrew linguist aboard the spy aircraft flying over Israel at the time, and that also, he clearly states his opinion that the attack was accidental. And yet, in spite of massive evidence and rational case for the friendly fire explanation, there are still those, and not just hate mongers, not just quacks, but including senior former U.S. officials, who continue to insist that the attack was deliberate. How can we explain it? Well, we have similar incidents. Recent, not so distant downing of an Iranian airliner by a USS warship that does not evoke the same type of controversy, the same type of conferences, certainly. First of all, we must say there's the involvement of the NSA, a highly secretive organization that is the subject of many conspiracy theories, not just that of the Liberty. But above all, and this must be said, there is the aspect of Israel, the Jewish state, and conspiracy theories relating to this Jewish state feed into classical cabal-style conspiracy libels. Now, purveyors of these allegations, with this I'll conclude, often call, as we've heard this morning, for an official and comprehensive U.S. investigation of the incident or an independent investigation of the incident. And in this point alone, I cannot disagree. Such an investigation, I am convinced, will turn up nothing new on the Israeli side. All of the information is out there. Everyone has given their testimony under oath. On the American side, there may be some difficult questions to ask as to why the Liberty was sent into the middle of somebody else's war zone, lightly armed and totally unannounced. I would invite such an inquiry, but again, I am confident that it will conclude that the Israel attack on the USS Liberty was a case of friendly fire, not all that different than the cases of friendly fire, which caused over 5,000 U.S. battle casualties in Vietnam that same year in 1967. I'm confident that the end of that inquiry will conclude that the case of the USS Liberty is indeed a case closed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oren. Okay, we're very pleased to have as our commentator Dr. Charles Smith, who is a member of the faculty and former head of the Near Eastern Studies Department at the University of Arizona. Professor Smith has lived and traveled widely in the Middle East. He's the author of 2 books, Islam and the Search for Social Order in Modern Egypt, and Palestine and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. And since everyone seems to be promoting book sales, I'll point out that the 5th edition of Dr. Smith's book will come out next month. Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Mark. I approach this podium with trepidation since I fear he will be waving his timer at me in about 15 minutes when I have some more things to say. As we can see from the papers that have been presented so far, it is not an understatement to state that controversy lingers regarding this incident. And as I remarked to a colleague when I first saw the papers that were sent to me, this panel did not appear to resemble one that I might chair or comment on at the American Historical Association. In approaching the subject, I will not address in any way all the issues that have been raised by the panelists. I would like to adhere to the idea of the title of the panel, which is War, Intelligence, and the USS Liberty, and then to approach certain issues with a primary focus on questions of sources and use of evidence, and what I might call the consistency of evidence. Are there contradictions here? What can we resolve from some of the arguments that have been made? And I would like to begin with Mr. Robarge's paper first in itself, and then in light of certain issues that were raised by Michael Oren in his book on the 1967 war. Mr. Robarge correctly notes the CIA estimate at the time that Israel could defeat all 3 Arab countries handily in the war that might erupt. This was also the conclusion of the Israeli military all along, which was eager for battle and the opportunity Nasser had handed them for justification for an attack by his blockade of the Straits of Tiran. This established, as has been noted, the casus belli situation in light of Israeli warnings of what would justify a new attack following the Suez Crisis of 1956, which was in part a response to Egyptian blockade of the same straits. Although it is true that Washington expected an Israeli attack, and as William Kwan has pointed out in an article in 1992, Washington had a back channel from the White House to Israel throughout the crisis, there is one question I wish to raise about Mr. Robarge's use of the term preemptive attack to describe the Israeli action. And that is, preemptive of what? By this time, as has been noted in introductory remarks, the Egyptians had signaled their desire to discuss the crisis through mediation by means of the visit of Zakaria Mohyeddin, an Egyptian vice president, who was due to arrive in Washington on the 7th of June. And as Michael Oren notes, the Egyptian advance team was due the 5th. Israel knew, therefore, by the latest on June 3rd, that Egypt appeared to be seeking a way out of the crisis. If this became public knowledge, Israel might have no obvious justification for an attack, regardless of Nasser's previous actions, which, certainly on the face of it, could have justified it. We know from Michael Oren's book that the Israeli cabinet discussed the impending visit of Muhyiddin. I think then we have to take this into consideration as a factor in deciding on the timing of the attack. This does not exclude all the other factors that preceded knowledge, but it does suggest that if Israel was going to attack at all, it had to do it to preempt public awareness of an Egyptian desire at mediation that appeared to be in the works. What about the USS Liberty and the claims that have been made? My remarks here are going to be limited to the materials available to me by the panelists. And I will say then I've not seen Judge Cristol's book, but I am aware of remarks that he has made online. And I'd like to try to identify some areas where there is agreement, and I don't think we need to contemplate areas where there are disagreements. You've already heard many of them. But I will move from paper to paper on certain issues as seems appropriate. Judge Cristol's paper, as opposed to his book, does not offer much in detail to justify his claims. That's not a remark about his book. It's about a remark about his comments in his paper. His attack on Mr. Bamford is getting everything wrong clearly suggests that Judge Cristol gets everything right, and it is obvious that the feeling is mutual. Judge Cristol's main contribution is his noting the initial positive identification of the Liberty as an American ship by Israeli naval intelligence. He argues that this information then was not passed on to naval units or to Air Force control or to Central Intelligence units. Now, Michael Oren suggests, and he mentioned this in his talk as well as in his paper, that there was an awareness of the Liberty as an American ship that was handed to intelligence sources or the Central Operating Board that was monitoring this situation. But he then states that this information was later removed. And he explained that this is standard Israeli practice, that you had a green marker on the board, but 2 hours later, that this was removed because you assumed that the Liberty had moved out of the area. Now, this may be standard Israeli practice, but in terms of questions of intelligence, it raises very serious questions about the viability of the analytical process. How do you know that the ship had left? What then are you going to base future actions on if you find a ship in the same area? So at the least, it seems to me that this is a marker, to use that term deliberately, of the failure of Israeli intelligence to observe movements in the precise area where they had previously identified an American ship. Judge Cristol is correct also in noting that Marvin Nowicki, the Hebrew language analyst who has been referred to, did dispute James Bamford's attribution to him of belief that the attack was intentional. I have seen the letter in the Wall Street Journal. I should also note here that while Mr. Bamford's body of secrets contains many references to National Security Agency sources, he does not provide them in his footnotes for the comments that he quotes Nowicki on in his text. And he does usually have such comments referring to NSA files for other quotes. This, to me, it seems, does weaken to a certain extent Mr. Bamford's case. What about the papers of Michael Oren, Mr. Bamford, and Mr. Hatch in comparison with each other? And here I'd like to focus on the question of sources used and then on the question of identification, because one of the key issues that comes up here is whether the Liberty was flying a flag, and is it conceivable that the Israelis never saw of such flags if they were flown? Now, Dr. Oren has noted, and he's relying on official Israeli sources, in hearings, he states that the ship did fly the standard 5 by 8 foot flag, which was subsequently replaced by a much larger flag, although the no Israeli pilot or torpedo captain ever saw such a flag. He also notes that the initial attacking planes made, in his own words, 2 low sweeps of the ship before attacking. But the Israeli accounts are consistent in stating that no pilots or naval officers ever saw a flag, despite such low sweeps. They continue to believe that the ship was Egyptian, despite the fact that the flags were flying, claiming later that the flags were obscured by smoke from shellings. If low sweeps were made prior to the attack, then why would no flags have been seen? There appear to be certain contradictions in Dr. Oren's account, and I'm referring to different pieces that he wrote, not always to the same piece, because I had several articles and a chapter from his book that were given to me. At one point, Dr. Oren mentions, as I've said, the low sweeps. At another, he states that observations were made at no lower than 3,000 feet. Liberty survivor testimony in James Innes's book mentioned Israeli aircraft at low levels observing them prior to the attack, which appears to be consistent with Oren's initial comment that I made about low sweeps. The problem for me here is that if, as Dr. Oren argues, the pilots, he's made this in an article, every effort, and I quote that, at identifying the ship, they obviously could not have done so from 3,000 feet. Now, whereas Michael Oren and Judge Cristol rely on Israeli and American investigations, James Bamford relies almost totally, not only, on National Security Agency reports, particularly Umbra files, which are not those referred to by Mr. Hatch. This leads them to state that the attacks were deliberate, in part because the flags were flying in a wind and were clearly visible. This is also part of the argument when you get into the nitty-gritty of this. Was there a wind? Was there a breeze? How strong was it? Was the flag flying? Was it hanging limp? All these details come to be considered. Does Dr. Hatch clear things up for once and for all? I'm afraid not, at least for me, although he does provide extremely interesting information based on the recently released files to which he refers. And in talking about sources, let me stress that the files Dr. Hatch uses are not the Umbra files that James Bamford states that he has used, which have still not been released and may never be released. Who knows? But there is a key distinction here, because where James Bamford's sources deal with and his account deal with the actual incident, he is covering the actual incident, Mr. Hatch, as he notes, is dealing only with the aftermath of the attack. So what are Dr. Hatch's findings and what do they reveal? Taking into consideration his own remarks about the limitation of such material, his paper confirms, as have several other remarks, that there were no Hebrew language linguists on the Liberty, only Arabic and Russian speakers. And this effectively scotches the supposition, which I admit I myself have held, that the Liberty was there in part to spy on Israel as well, and that this had something to do with an impending attack on Syria. This is wrong. Dr. Hatch concludes that the interceptions that he mentions strongly suggest, in his terms, that the Israeli attackers did not know they were firing at an American ship. The problem with this conclusion is that his files deal only with the aftermath of the attack, not the attack itself. He could rightfully respond that helicopter pilots believed it was an Egyptian ship when they went out. Nonetheless, if these helicopter pilots could clearly see an American flag waving over the ship, is it credible to think the torpedo boats who had been there for some time never saw it? In other words, Dr. Hatch's account does not resolve matters as fully as one might have hoped. What about the reliability of sources, which historians have to question at all times? The value of Hatch's intercept is what I would call its real-time accessibility, its immediacy. And I distinguish this from the availability for anyone of the Israeli intercepts as judged by Israelis or others, because there are political ramifications there that are clearly important. And we also then have the ex post facto nature of Israeli and American investigations. As is the case with many examinations of sources, how do we know that all information was considered or included, given the apparent interest of both Israel and the United States in settling the matter quickly? Governments often pick and choose among sources they decide to reveal or keep from view, And there is an extensive literature on what we call the selective use of such documentation. World War I, for example, and the great powers is an excellent example. There is also the continuing question of gaps between the results of American investigations and claims that the conclusions that an accident occurred were politically inspired. This is still, as we see, the strong belief of many senior retired naval personnel, not just the surviving crew and officers of the Liberty. There is no way, at this time, at least for me, to prove or to contradict these claims. What we can look into here, and this is something that was mentioned in opening remarks, is the context of the Cold War and a burgeoning American-Israeli alliance that was developing at this time. Having avoided a confrontation with the Soviets during the war and deeply involved, becoming ever more deeply involved in Vietnam, would the Johnson administration have been eager to openly confront Israel, which it had given at least a yellow light signal to attack to start hostilities, especially given the euphoria that swept the U.S. over the Israeli victory? Not likely. The United States at the time would instead probably have been eager to accept an Israeli apology and move on. Would this apology have been insincere? Not at all. Let me stress here that I see no evidence, and I disagree with Mr. Bamford, that senior political or military officials were involved. This does not take into account, however, the actions on the scene at the operational level of the personnel who were involved in the attacks. And I'm making a very clear distinction between higher-ups and those who are actually undertaking the attacks at the time. What has been resolved? Not as much as we might hope. We can put the rest of the idea that the Liberty was spying on Israel. It seems clear to me that the Liberty did fly flags, replacing one with a larger one, even if the Israeli attackers said they never saw one. Motivations for the attack. James Bamford, and I'm moving away from what has been resolved, James Bamford asserts that Israel attacked out of fear that the Liberty was listening in on reports of a massacre of Egyptian prisoners in the Sinai, near El Arish. There is no way to prove or disprove these claims. There were rumors to that effect in the press at some time in the past. They've disappeared. My own feeling is that if this were true, that the Egyptians would have pressed this case much more forcibly than they ever did, and they did not, to my knowledge. What are my own views on this in conclusion, before analyzing maybe some broader ramifications of this? My own feelings, based on the evidence that has been presented to me, and obviously I have not gone into this in all the detail that many others have, but my feeling is that the Israeli pilots, certainly the pilots, if not the torpedo captains, should have known that the ship was an American ship. And the idea you could have such a discrepancy between the Liberty going at 5 knots and their estimate of a 30-knot speed of that ship is, to me, quite astonishing. If the Israeli pilots did not know the ship was American, they did not, because, it seems to me, they did not try hard enough to identify the vessel. Here I think that Dr. Oren is a little bit too defensive in rejecting the idea that Israeli pilots and naval officers might be guilty of at least gross negligence. That was rejected by the Israeli Court of Inquiry. But to me, it is not impossible. Gross negligence is not the same as deliberate complicity in knowingly attacking a ship of a friendly power. But it does indicate that not all precautions at identification were taken. And this seems to me quite possible, given the inconsistencies in the accounts of Jay Cristol and Dr. Oren as to what heights the plane flew, what surveillance was actually undertaken, etc. All of this raises questions in my mind which lead to the idea that you may have had a sudden decision to attack without proper means and care of approaching the subject more carefully. And for me, the absolute consistency of the pilots and torpedo crews that they never saw any flags flying until the end is a little bit too neat. In the chaos of war, things do happen. There can be contradictory statements. I think it would have been far better for the Israeli government in its apology to have admitted negligence on the part of its pilots rather than claiming there was none. This can certainly include the argument that mistakes were made and they were honest, human error was involved, which is quite different from assumptions of complicity in attacks with prior knowledge of the identification of the ship. And here then, while I am disagreeing with Dr. Oren and Judge Cristol, I am also disagreeing with James Bamford, who has argued that clearly there was operational oversight of this and that higher-ups and senior personnel were quite aware of what had occurred. What can we get out of these papers in a broader context? Since I've been told I have 2 minutes, which is less than that now. These papers suggest that the value of intelligence is limited for cases such as this, not just because governments are so reluctant to reveal what they know. But as we see, Dr. Hatch's files were allowed the light of day only last July. Files dealing with the attack remain closed, and there's no way of actually confirming if they actually exist. And one way to resolve many of these issues would be to see the files that Mr. Bamford has referred to and to be able to examine them and to compare them with all the other information that we have. There are some broader questions as well. What was the role and input, perhaps appropriate at a conference like this, of the State Department in this crisis, as opposed to the CIA, the Department of Defense, and the White House? Something that was not mentioned in the talks, but was mentioned in the papers, is that Harry McPherson was a presidential envoy in Israel throughout this crisis. And as Bill Kwan has pointed out in the article I referred to, you definitely had a channel from the White House to Israel independent of the State Department, which was letting them know perhaps a bit more encouragement about the possibility of an attack than would have come from the State Department itself. But does McPherson's presence in Israel suggest that the White House was running its own policy even more broadly than we have known by having its own representative in Israel to whom Israelis would go rather than to the ambassador? It is significant in terms of one of the remarks in the papers which is arguing against a deliberate attack, that the Israelis went to McPherson and informed him the day before that they were going to attack the Golan Heights. I would like to see if there is any evidence they also informed the ambassador. What the Liberty incident appears to confirm is that we see here what we see elsewhere, the compartmentalization of information, both in intelligence circles as well as within the governmental decision-making structure. And that this was true in Israel as well as in the United States. In this light, and I think we've seen this on this panel, the reaction to the Liberty incident may be as significant as the incident itself, as politicians, and then later scholars as well, sought to grasp the significance and implication of developments of which they had been unaware. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for comments that would be perfectly in place at a meeting of the American Historical Association. As Dr. Smith pointed out, a couple of our presenters winged it a bit and did not actually deliver the papers they had submitted. I'd also thank Dr. Oren for, as he put it, putting the gloves back on. I'd like to now have a brief discussion among the panel members, and I guess I'll ask the first question. And that's for my colleague, Dr. Hatch. I remember we're dealing with an era now in which the initials NSA used to said to be stood for no such agency. And now NSA is now coming out and releasing a fairly significant amount of documentation. And I guess what has led, I guess, from the historian's perspective to this change in viewpoint?
I think a lot of factors. NSA is moving from the initial standing for no such agency to nothing sacred anymore. At least it seems that way. I hope that's not the case. I think there's a combination of factors. I think certainly some of the official changes in rules on declassification have led us to be more open. And I think there's a realization that we can be more open, that many of the things that occurred in the past are now available for declassification because sources and methods have changed, and it won't do national harm to release some of them. But of course, that's not the case for everything. There are legitimate reasons for protecting some things. Some things, such as in the current case, it's been decided we can let out without harm.
Okay. I would now like to invite our panelists to basically question each other and at a reasonably moderate level. Duck under the table, yes. Judge Cristol?
I'd like to answer Dr. Smith's question. He said that he wondered if there was any evidence of that McPherson communication with Israel, and I don't know if it's in the volume, but State Department Cable 008002 is a report from Ambassador Barber, the United States ambassador in Israel, and advising the Secretary of State of the meeting with General Yariv, Chief of Israeli Intelligence, at 11:30 on the morning of June the 8th, in which twice they discuss the impending attack on Syria. And this sort of disposes of the Syrian attack theory, because it doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense that Israel would tell the United States at 11:30 in the morning of June 8th about their intentions on Syria, and then attack the United States ship at 2 in the afternoon to keep them from finding out the secret.
It seems unfair, but I also want to respond just to a small part that from Professor Smith's presentation. I just mentioned to him before. One is that the fact that I conveyed the findings of the Israeli Judicial Board of Inquiry, that there was no case of criminal negligence here, doesn't mean that I personally sign on to those findings. And nor did many Israelis sign on to the findings. The Israeli records reveal a strong difference of opinion between the Army and the U.S. Embassy in Washington, which very much wanted to see some heads roll over the Liberty incident, and the Army balked at it. Rabin made a big case out of it. A very strong correspondence between Israel Ambassador Harman and Yitzhak Rabin as the chief of the IDF. I do think that there are elements of negligence, perhaps less than criminal negligence, but severe negligence on the Israeli side. But I also feel there's cases of severe negligence on the American side, on the NSA side, and certainly heads didn't roll on that side as well. There were several Israeli officers who were cashiered in the aftermath of the Liberty incident. As to whether 3,000 feet constitutes a low sweep over a high sweep, I'll have to defer to the Navy pilots in the audience. I would say that any pilot who goes in for too low a swope over a presumed enemy vessel is taking his life into his hands and is not likely to do so with great relish. And it begs the question whether in the middle of a war, when you're not really looking for somebody else's boat, you're basically, pilots, according to the Israeli transcripts, were asked to ascertain whether the ship was Israeli or not whether the ship was American or not. And Israeli ships, as I said earlier, were very clearly marked. Once they ascertained that it was not an Israeli ship, and it was in a war zone, then the natural reaction of any soldier in any army in wartime would be to open fire on that vessel. And this is really the conclusion of the Israeli judicial inquiry. The main question of criminal negligence went, as you intimated yourself, to whether it was prudent and judicious to remove those markers from the board.
May I respond to that?
Sure.
Oh, I'm glad to have these clarifications. One point about my remarks about negligence, I do think that if the Israeli government had made such an admission, this would have muted the anger that we still have lingering today within the United States, particularly within the Navy, about that particular incident. It would at least have been an admission of responsibility, which is certainly not the same thing as what many claim, that there was this deliberate attack, which was approved by the higher-ups. With respect to heights, never having been a pilot myself, I cannot testify to this. One of the things that we might keep in mind is Judge Cristol, in one of his online remarks, states that the 5x8 flag could not have been seen at a distance beyond 1,323 feet. And so if Israeli pilots were not going below 3,000, then there's no way they could have tried to identify the ship. So this gives you an idea of some of the problems in interpretation that we are dealing with here.
Okay, Jim?
I'd like to just clarify a couple of things that Dr. Smith brought up, and also Judge Cristol. It's this thing with Nowicki. Marvin Nowicki was a crew member of one of the planes that was flying over the area where the attack was taking place, at the time it was taking place. Marvin Nowicki contacted me. I didn't contact him. He contacted me. He sent me a very long, it was about 15, 20-page email explaining everything that took place in that plane at that time during that incident. I quoted from that, and you know, if Dr. Smith saw the, I don't know if he saw it, but the footnote is right in the back, quoting from the Nowicki email. In addition, Nowicki complained about it that I took a different view than he did on it. He was a supporter of Israel. That was his view. Actually, in my book, that's what I said. I said at the time, based on the fractured conversations he heard on the intercepts, Nowicki just assumed that the attack was a mistake. I don't know how else I could have said that, but that's what he believed, was the attack was a mistake. So he complains a lot because he doesn't like my outcome, but I gave him full credit for his view that it was a mistake. The second point with Dr. Smith was there wasn't rumors of Israeli attacks on Egyptian prisoners of war during that period of time during the '67 war. There were numerous front-page newspaper articles, including full-length articles, large articles in Time magazine, October 2nd, 1995, very long article, opening grave wounds, evidence of Israeli atrocities during 1967 war with Egypt threatens the country's fragile ties. Goes on for pages. The Washington Post, Israel reported killing POWs in '67 war. Historians say deaths of hundreds of Egyptians was covered up. The Jewish Telegraph Agency, historian alleges PO deaths in 1956. And on and on. The New York Times has a long article on it. So this was not a rumor. These were things that were happening at the time. I don't want to go into it now, but it's explained in a lot of these articles why the Egyptians decided not to pursue this. But the New York Times here, after general tells of killing POWs in '56, Israelis argue over ethics of war, and it goes on quoting about 1967, the 1967 war, quoting people about what was taking place here. So I just want to clear that up. This is not a rumor. These are articles that appeared in major newspapers and magazines about incidents that took place there. And I had one question for Dr. Oren. He talks about the fact that there was this machine gun fire from the Liberty, which triggered the reaction from the torpedo boats. Yet, you know, if you take a look at some of the new information that came out in some of the NSA documents, one of the things it says is, understand that she is hit and cannot fire. This is from the command to the pilot of the helicopter. And then the response is, no fire was observed from it, and also those on board did not fire at the ones attacking. I mean, so if they didn't fire, then where is this coming from? And also the crew members basically say that there was no fire coming from the ship. And a third point is the first thing that the planes did, the Israeli Mirages, when they attacked the ship, which is the logical thing to do, the first thing they did was wipe out the machine gun nests on the ship. The second thing they did was wipe out the communications facility on the ship. So the issue over whether there was fire from the ship, I think, is still up in the air, but it certainly is not a decided point, and it certainly isn't justification for them to attack the Liberty. And final point is, regardless of the flag, ships carry large numbers on their side that are able to be looked up just like police look up license tags. Those numbers are carried in books contained in every single Navy in the world, called Jane's Fighting Ships, and every ship should have one. One of the things that came out in these new NSA documents, as a matter of fact, was a question about this here, 310. Helicopter 815 informed the torpedo boat. Helicopter informed the torpedo boat that GTR-5 was written on the ship and inquired if this meant anything. The torpedo boat replied, negative. It doesn't mean anything. How can it not mean anything? You're about to blow up a ship with 5 torpedoes.
Jim, I think we have to cut now. We only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to take at least a couple of questions from the audience. Please, if you would like to ask a question, line up at the microphones over there or over there. Please state your name, any institutional affiliation you would like to provide, and ask your question with the firm, and I emphasize firm admonition, that it be brief and to the point. And we only have a few minutes, so we're not going to be able to take more than a couple of questions. Yes?
First off, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Joseph Charles Lentini. I'm a retired Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy. And in June the 8th of 1967, I was one of 4 non-commissioned officers responsible for the communications center aboard the USS Liberty. I was there, and for the last 36 years, I've studied this whole issue. Dr. Oren, I'd like a signed copy of your book if you have one, and I want to thank you for your story. Jay Cristol introduced me a moment ago as a friend. We have had lunch numerous times. We have talked several times. We are acquaintances. There is a difference in my vocabulary about what a friend is, just as I did not know Captain McGonigal was his friend.
Mr. Lantini, please, a question.
Mr. Cristol said that the flag was first observed during the attack, when the attack was over. Naval liaison officers, the torpedo boat captain, and the flotilla commander all say that they saw the flag, the red of the flag, after the torpedo hit. There's an inconsistency there. Dr. Oren says that they ceased fire immediately according to his investigation.
Please,
I would, it's hard to ask a single question because there has been so many half-truths and misstatements made up here today.
Please, there are a lot of people behind you who'd like to
I understand that, but this is for history, correct? The Israelis did not cease fire immediately. They kept firing. That's a fact. I was there. The jets did not fly over 2 slow passes trying to identify our vessel. In fact, we saw them coming in on radar, and the war call was photographer to the bridge. And they came in at treetop level.
Mr. Lantini, please, a question or cede the microphone.
Well, what question do you ask? How do you justify? Okay, let's. How do you justify trying to define what happened on June the 8th, 1967, by a gentleman who was, if he was alive at the time, was in diapers, by a gentleman who has obvious reasons?
Thank you for your comments, please. We have the next person.
Joe, we got to go to the
please.
other side.
Yeah.
We got to go to the other side.
I'm sorry.
It doesn't make sense.
Thank you.
Well,
next question, please.
if anyone's interested in the facts, we can get them online. No,
next question, please.
It's not an emotional issue. It's a fact.
Excuse me, please. Another question?
Yeah, my question is really a little bit broader than that. My name is Grant Smith from the Institute for Research Middle Eastern Policy. It seems as though the Liberty is really serving here as a metaphor, some kind of proxy battle in which we've got Israelis abroad and in the U.S. It's a symbol of perhaps U.S. unfairness or even anti-Semitism to even raise this question. For other Americans, it reflects this growing discomfort of the Israeli-U.S. relation and kind of the fact that in the U.S. Founding Father George Washington, he didn't want us to have any passionate attachments to foreign countries like we've grown to have. I'd like to ask the panel in general whether you think this is a proxy battle and whether the Liberty is really the issue. Thank you.
Any volunteers?
Oh, okay, now the microphone's on.
Wait, please.
Hello?
Brief answer.
I think that the answer is that certainly there are people who are on both sides of the Arab-Israeli conflict who are arguing this issue, and sadly I think that that's unfortunate both from a historian's point of view, because we're here to find history. If there's any new evidence out there that anyone has, send it to me and I'll incorporate it in my work. If I find proof going in a different direction, I'll gladly disclose it. But I think that unfortunately people who have their own agendas keep this thing alive and keep torturing the survivors, like were Joe Lentini, who, I mean, if after these years he wants to believe that the attack was intentional, that gives him comfort, bless him, let him so believe. But I suggest to you that if you're interested in the history, look at the facts and make up your own decision.
Okay. Question from over here.
Okay. My name is Josie Lennon. My brother was Stephen Spencer Toth, Naval Academy class of '63. One of the ones who received a Silver Star for trying to find out what the markings were on the planes that apparently were unmarked. And so he was on an exposed area at the top of the ship, blown down 4 decks. They apparently jammed, the Israelis knew that our radio, they knew our frequency, so they jammed our radio so that we couldn't, the Liberty people couldn't radio for help. I also understand that Mr. Orem's book is that he belongs to an organization that's to make Israel look good.
Excuse me, please, do you have a question?
Well,
please ask the question.
Well, about the radar.
You want to know about radar jamming?
Yes, but
okay.
I also wanted to know some other things.
One question.
I wanted to understand
one question,
why.
Please. Is there anyone here who would like to address the question of the radar jamming?
As far as I know, that's true. According to the people who were in the Radio Shack at the time on the ship, first of all, they shot up the antennas as badly as they could right when the attack first took place, and there was no way that they could get out any messages because of the jamming. There was a message that they managed to get out just before everything started, a request for help from the 6th Fleet, but after that, there was very little communication from the ship because everything, including the large satellite dish on the back, were completely blown up.
Okay. One last question over here. Bill? Excuse me, please.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead. I'm Captain Castle, the Naval Attaché. 40 years ago, I had no idea that these many people would bring this much intelligence and effort together to talk about the Liberty incident. I want to make only one comment to you, Mr. Robarch. In addition to your observations, it was my understanding from General Yariv, the Chief of Intelligence for Israel, in talking to General Rabin, then the commander, that the accumulation of Egyptian armor in the Sinai represented an opportunity which Israel could not pass up. Yariv said to Rabin, if we destroy all that now, we guarantee ourselves 6 years of peace when there is no force that we could fight against it. With regard to the Liberty incident, if I'd known this would be such an opportunity to sell books, I'd have written one. With regard to the Liberty incident, I think we have proved again, and my question to the panel would be, will this ever end while there are still living people who have various memories of that event? Thank you.
I think you're probably correct in assuming that it won't. Our time has run out, and I think I'll just assert my prerogative as moderator, make the final comment here. I don't know if we settled anything. I think perhaps we've shed a little light on different aspects of this question. And as I said at the beginning, I encourage you all...
Let's hear from the other survivor. One more survivor.
Excuse me, please.
One more survivor.
Excuse me, please.
2 Israelis and one...
Excuse me, please.
One more survivor has a right to talk.
Would you please?
Please, sir, please.
That's okay.
Let
him speak.
Excuse me, please.
Let him speak.
Excuse me, please. Would you please leave the auditorium, please? Please, excuse me, we're trying to have an academic conference here. I think you should read the documents and then see what they have before you make that kind of a comment, all right? We, as I started to say, maybe we've shed some light. Obviously, there are some who have not seen any, but I encourage you all to read the documents. I encourage you all to take time to analyze, take a look at which each of our panelists have written, and see which one you think comes closest to what might be an accurate description of the situation. We've had a lot of talk of friendly fire and the fog of war, and I'm just going to leave you, I think, with the comments of two noted military observers, one real and one fictional. The first was General William Tecumseh Sherman of the Union Army during the American Civil War, who said that war is hell. And the second is Captain Benjamin Franklin Pierce of the 407 7th MASH Unit, Korea, by way of Hollywood, who disagreed with Sherman. And he said, war isn't hell, war is war, and hell is hell, and the difference is that war is worse, because there are no innocent bystanders in hell. I'd like to thank all our panelists, thank the members of the audience. Those of the panelists and other presenters who are staying for lunch, please remain around the center of the table. All the other members of the audience, please leave through the back exits. You must be escorted from the building. If you would like to return for the afternoon session, please be back here by 1 p.m. Someone left their keys at security upstairs this morning. If they're yours, come and get them. Thank you all. Excuse me, please. Excuse me.